Ready? Ready?
Indy, Henry, follow me. I know the way. Ah!
Got lost in his own museum, huh?
Uh-huh.
After you, Junior.
Yes, sir.
Without a long winding introduction, I'd like to give a big warm welcome to David, and we'll start the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Duncan. I met Duncan years ago when I first came to Australia. He was working for Simply Living magazine. Since then, I've been here a couple of times. I'll tell you just a few things about myself. I was born in France, 1957. My parents were Americans. I grew up in mountains of Colorado, Montana. I'd always been interested in UFOs, and psychic phenomena, lost cities, ancient history. Okay, right over here? Is that where you want me? All right. Okay, so be careful. Don't heckle me too much because we're all going to be on, you're going to be on camera. So, okay, yeah, I was born in France. My parents were Americans. I grew up in the mountains, Colorado, Montana. I've always been interested in lost cities, history, psychic phenomena, UFO, ancient technology. I traveled quite a bit with my parents. They like to travel. One reason I was born in Europe. We'd been to Mexico and to Turkey and things like that when I was a teenager. I was very much a mountain nut and loved mountain climbing and camping and backpacking. Grew up in a small town in Colorado. Sir Edmund Hillary was one of my heroes as a kid, first climber of Mount Everest from New Zealand. So I wanted to go to the Himalayas and climb and live in monasteries. I'd read that book by Rama, The Third Eye, too, in high school. I used to read a lot of books like that, and that kind of gave me this romantic vision of Tibet, you know, which Tibet is not like that very much, although it is a very mysterious place. I think another show that affected me as a kid was a show in America called Kung Fu. You might have seen that. It was David Carradine and all that. Also, I used to, I was younger than that. I used to watch these cartoons called Johnny Quest. Johnny Quest and his pal Haji, they ran around the world searching for lost cities and mysteries and that kind of thing. So I was very interested in really adventure, lost cities, and began traveling at an early age. I studied Chinese at the University of Montana, as well as archaeology, philosophy, comparative religious studies. And eventually I went to Taiwan as an English teacher and began teaching English in Taiwan, all the time on my way to the Himalayas and Mount Everest and Tibet and all that. And actually saved my money. I was just 19 at the time. Got to India, began living in India, Kathmandu, began trekking all through the Himalayas. Never did climb Mount Everest, but we did climb some mountains there. That was good. Began traveling across Asia. And once I got on the road, there was just no stopping me. I traveled for like 6 years all through Asia and Africa. At that time, I was your typical $5 a day traveler kind of guy. If I had a few $100s on me, I thought I was rich. Wanted to go to the Great Pyramid. Meanwhile, I would get odd jobs as I went. I lived in Israel on a kibbutz. Eventually, I got a job in Africa, in Sudan, working with a catering company in Sudan. Did that for a year, made quite a bit of money. Suddenly I had like $10,000, which was a lot to me back in the late 70s. Later, Sudanese guerrillas, there was a war going on in Sudan at the time. It's much worse now. I had worked in this camp out in the swamps of Sudan. Later, Ananya II guerrillas, this revolutionary group in southern Sudan, came to the camp and killed everyone, including probably to replace me. I had left by that time, gone on through Africa. At one point, I was in Uganda during the civil war there, which was kind of a crazy place to be, a tourist on holiday, but looted Idi Amin's house during the war, had Tanzanian soldiers who were drunk trying to kill me, just kind of being, you know, stranger in the wrong place at the wrong time sort of thing. Eventually returned to India, returned to the United States, and there I began writing the books that I write now. My first book was a book called A Hitchhiker's Guide to Africa and Arabia. It was published by a relatively major publishing company in the United States at the time. And I began living in Stell, this intentional community in the Midwest of the United States. Started writing books, started my own company, Adventures Unlimited, and continued to keep traveling. It was at this time that I started doing all my travels throughout the Pacific and South America and Central America. I've spent several years going through some remote jungle areas and living on remote Pacific islands. So anyway, today, I thought we would start out with some kind of lost cities and some pretty amazing things in the Pacific. And we'll go first to the mysterious island of Ponape in Micronesia. Ponape Island is about 1,000 miles to the northeast of New Guinea. It is now the capital of the Federated States, Micronesia. It's a very jungle-covered island. It's got mountains in the interior. Much of it is still unexplored, in fact. On that island is many ruins, huge megalithic ruins. Also on the island, they drink a root similar to kava in Fiji. It's called sakau. It's like a mildly narcotic root. This is a stone made out of basalt that they used to pound the root out. Here they wear grass skirts. It is from Micronesia that the grass skirts came from, as like in Hawaii. And on that city, on the island, is one of the wonders of the world. I call it the eighth wonder of the world, and it is the giant canal city of Nan Madol, which is in the Medelannan province of Ponape. And it's not actually built onto the island of Ponape. Nan Madol is built into the ocean. It's a city that is more than 10 square miles in size, and it is built out of 20 to 30 to 40 ton basalt crystals, which are naturally formed and crystalline and are magnetized. It's a huge city. This is the largest structure in Nan Madol. It's called Nandawas, and it has walls 30 feet high, 30, 40 feet high, built out of these magnetized blocks of stone. The largest stone at Nan Madol is said to weigh 50 tons, or about 100,000 pounds. There are not even modern cranes on the island today that can lift some of these stones there. You can see how the construction, giant walls of these blocks, and they're stacked in a kind of log cabin fashion going up. Now today, the islanders really do not like to go to the city. No one lives there, and they believe that if you spend the night there, you'll die. They believe that the city is haunted, and here we go. It is, now notice here these basalt crystals. They naturally form this way. It's prismatic basalt. I just came from Tasmania, and Mount Wellington there has a similar formation. They crystallize in these cliffs, and they form 6 or 7 or 8-sided logs of crystal. Basalt is extremely heavy and also is naturally magnetic. When you go into the city, you see that you feel this energy field. If you take your compass and you move it along these walls, your compass will go haywire. It just starts going around in a circle. And apparently the stones should be magnetized anyway, but there is an anomalous magnetic field there. You can really see how huge the wall is. You can see the canal here on the side. If you look up in here, you see the large lichen patches that are on the stone. Lichen is usually indicative, always is in fact, of tremendous age of a stone. lichen grows very, very slowly, eating the rock. Wherever you see a large lichen patch, you know that you're looking at stones that are thousands of years old. Okay, now you can see how it is a canal city. Namdal is a city that is 10 square miles wide and is built out of more than 100 artificial islands that are built up and cut into this coral reef, and then on top of the artificial islands are built the huge structures. During high tide, you go walking through the city. Here we go. Okay, notice again the large lichen patches on this. Here's the large doors going in. The whole thing has collapsed. The city is many thousands of years old. What the Smithsonian Institute came there, this is how your traditional archaeologists work. They came to the island and they found a tortoise shell, and they dated then this tortoise shell in this pit. This tortoise shell was 600 years old. Somebody had basically cooked a tortoise there on one of the islands. So naturally, the Smithsonian Institute then said, well, we've got a 600-year-old tortoise shell here in the city, and that's how old the city is. The city is 600 years old. So the idea that somehow the city was many thousands of years older than that, and that somebody had just eaten a turtle there 600 years ago doesn't occur to them at all. And in fact, I mean, which is obviously the case. Don't forget, this city is not on the island of Ponape. It's built into the ocean. Countless typhoons and other things like that have come through there. What has collapsed the walls, these giant walls, is actually trees that have over hundreds, thousands of years grown into the walls, and then when a typhoon comes, it will wrench that tree out, and the tree becomes like a lever and is able to collapse some of the walls. Here you can see how the city is beginning to flood at high tide. We're standing on one of the walls and looking down. The water is coming in. It's actually covering part of the walls and the sidewalks there. Okay, you can see again how the walls are stacked up, the huge basalt crystals there. The more time I've spent on this island, the more mysterious it gets. Now, we had heard stories of a sunken city. A sunken city there in the island. Now, we decided, we contacted this man, and his name was Masao Hadley. He's now deceased. Masao Hadley was the Nam Marquet of the Mediterranean province of Namdal. Now, it's curious, it's interesting to note that Ponape, the island, is divided into 5 states or districts. And then the chief of each of the districts, or like district governor, is in their own language called the Nam Marquet. Now, in ancient Egypt, the districts of Egypt were divided into areas which they called nomes or noms. And a district governor in ancient Egypt was called a Nam Marquet. We have the exact same word as in ancient Egyptian and in the local Ponapean dialect, meaning exactly the same thing, a district governor. This was Masao Hadley. Now, we went to Masao Hadley and we asked him questions about the city. We said, well, how did they build this city? Well, he says, and it's very much the island legend, that the stones of the city were flown through the air, levitated, and put into place. This is what they say. Another thing to mention here is that they do not know where the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of prismatic basalt came to build that city. They don't know. The site of that quarry has never been found. It's possible it's submerged. Even there are tales that it came from another island. Well, one of the things with the islanders themselves is they have a belief similar to the kahuna on Hawaii, and that is that they have to keep secrets. They believe that if they tell you everything they know, they will die. So therefore, they never will volunteer any information. And in fact, I probably know more about Nam Nadal than most people on the island do, simply because everyone knows that you have to keep secrets. If you're not from this area where the city is, you won't, it's just tradition, you wouldn't go there. Being a foreigner, I've contacted Masao Hadley and asked him a lot of questions. And when you ask them questions, you've got to always ask the right questions. They'll never volunteer information to you. They'll answer your question, but never tell you anything more than you have asked. So it's always a game of playing 20 questions with them and keep asking them the right question. And if you keep leading them down the right path, they'll give you some astonishing answers. So one of the questions that we asked them was, is there a sunken city? And he was very surprised when we asked, was there a sunken city there? And because we had heard that in one of Eric von Doniken's books, he goes to this island, and in there he talks about weird, solid platinum coffins found underwater, things like that. We tried to find out if that was true. It was difficult to verify that, although we did find that during the Japanese occupation, a large amount of platinum was exported out of Micronesia, and we don't know where that could have come from. Anyway, he raised his eyebrows and said, wow, how did you know about the sunken city? And then we kept questioning him about it, and he said, yes, there is a sunken city there. And that sunken city, he said, was called Kanimweso. Kanimweso, he said, was the city of the gods and was underwater. The story that he tells is that two brothers who had a lot of magic and science came from the east, the southeast. He believes either from Tahiti or from South America. And the two brothers came and they climbed a mountain along the coast, and this mountain is naturally pyramidal in shape. And looking down, they then saw this city of the gods, Kanimweso, the sunken city. They saw that city, and then they went and built Nan Madol, the basalt crystal city, which you've just seen slides. So we asked Masao Hadley, we said, okay, take us, please, to the side of this sunken city. We'll go diving for it. And he did. So we began, what we discovered were columns underwater at about 60 feet, just off Nandawas, the main structure. Now here's the thing, is that Nan Madol itself is built on this huge coral reef that goes out into the ocean, built onto the coral, and then there's a big drop-off. It's very unusual, this coral reef, because it just drops straight down at places. There are also, by the way, giant tunnels that go underwater all through this city. Some of the tunnels come out into these cliffs that you can see underwater, and it's all underwater. Now at about 60 feet, we came to these columns that were standing perfectly straight up into the ground, into the air. Here we are. The columns were encrusted with coral. We used our diving knives and things like that to try and see what it was underneath the coral. There was so much coral growth, we couldn't get beyond the coral. The water there is very murky. Generally in Micronesia, the water is nice and warm and highly clear, but right where this area is where a river comes in, so there's quite a bit of silt that comes down and clouds things up. It's pretty spooky diving there. They say that there are two special sharks that are the guardians of the underwater city. We were told not to molest these sharks or take spear guns. Here you can see a diver just on top of one of the columns. These columns would be like 30 or 40 feet high, coming about 60 feet of water. An archaeologist from University of Ohio has done special alignments on these underwater structures and found that there is an alignment there. There's a whole chapter in my book on lost cities of ancient Lemuria in the Pacific where I go into that. It's got maps of these alignments. Here we go. More what apparently are underwater structures, coral encrusted. we are. Okay, let's see. You can see just barely a column there along the left. So we're diving, this is anywhere from 60 to 80 feet underwater. Now, in other areas nearby there, and remember there's 100 artificial islands, and in other areas there are stones that you can free dive to. Here we go. Now you can see here what is clearly a big log of basalt. You can even see what appears to be lichen there. This is probably in about 12 feet of water. The islands themselves that the huge walls are built on are also built up artificially. Again, you can see giant, I mean, these are blocks of stone weighing 10 to 20,000 pounds. Huge, huge basalt crystals. Now, one of the things that we decided, our solution eventually to what was going on here, I mean, really we were finding underwater structures. We were mystified by the weird tunnels going underwater. Back in 1919, a story was written, and you can get it as a paperback. It's called The Moon Pool, and it's also about this city. And in that science fiction story, there is also these underwater tunnels and things like that going underneath the city. They absolutely exist. And in that story, in the Moon Pool, what happens is these people spend the night there, which of course the islanders would say, don't do that, you'll die. And in that story, this like a kind of a underwater creature, like from one of these Creatures of the Black Lagoon type movies, comes out of this pool. These underwater tunnels really exist. Here we also see how coral has grown. You can see this line kind of growing through of the coral. It's almost like blocks of stone joining and the coral growing over it. What we finally came up with was, as a solution to all this, was that the underwater city had essentially grown over, and the coral reef itself was over this ancient city. And the coral reef was the city. And so it was like two cities on top of each other. One was the relatively modern city, still built thousands of years ago, which is built on top of this basically coral-encrusted city. So this coral reef grew over the city as it submerged and ultimately, eventually covered the city. But where you had, say, streets or perhaps canals at that time of the city, as the coral grew over it, it created like this weird tunnel system as it grew over the building, so that there were now these passages and tunnels underwater with the coral growing together. This is the more underwater stones here. Diving again to giant blocks. At times, at really low tide, some of these blocks were just barely starting to go above the water. Big blocks of stone coming in. Here we go. This is the one I was trying to get. Now, one of the unusual things that we discovered underwater was that above water we could not find any kinds of petroglyphs or carved writing or anything. It was just this bare city, half destroyed, half submerged. But now, in this one stone underwater, we did find what apparently were some kind of signs carved into the rock. This is basalt, extremely hard rock to carve. Here you can see at the bottom what appears to be a square. The square's been carved in, cut in. Right up here was a cross and a triangle. It was like 4 different signs carved in this block. It's about as, fortunately, underwater photography is kind of difficult. More blocks of stone underneath the water. Okay. Back in the late 1800s, there was a British colonel. His name was James Churchward. And he was an officer in the British Army and lived in India for many years. While he lived in India during those years, he claimed that he was introduced to a Brahmin priest who ran this temple in northern India, and in this temple was a secret library. And in this library was full of ancient books and tablets. These things do absolutely exist in India. There's no reason why he couldn't have had this experience. And he spent a lot of time with this priest, he claimed, and then eventually this priest told him what was in some of these books, and they deciphered them. And essentially what he said was that there had been this ancient continent in the Pacific called Mu. Mu was like the motherland of mankind. Various races had lived there, and ultimately from Mu had spread out all over the world to various civilizations. Mu was a civilization that went back 100,000 years, something like that. His map of Mu that Churchward published, his first books were published in the 30s. In America, he eventually moved to the United States. He wrote a book called The Lost Continent of Mu. His second book was called The Children of Mu. He then wrote 3 other books on the cosmic forces of Mu and the sacred symbols of Mu. So here, his Mu came to start. Easter Island was at one edge, Hawaii up the very north, Tahiti and the Marquesas. Ponape Island is right here on the far left side, and then the Ladrone Islands, which is with Guam and those kind of things, were all part of Mu. Churchward traveled throughout the Pacific at the turn of the century, searching on his quest for the evidence of Mu. Now another group, which they called the Lemurian Fellowship, and this was their map that they published in about 1938 or so. They were a popular group. They existed in California in the 40s, and their Mu was slightly different and enlarged from Churchward's. For instance, it included all of Australia and New Zealand. Hawaii was at the center. It even included parts of California. Essentially, their lost continent of Mu outlined the Pacific tectonic plate. In the late 60s was a geological revolution of tectonic plates, how the Earth has got these continental plates, and they are all jostling up and moving against each other. And really this is, in a way, geologically a very accurate map of the Pacific tectonic plate. I mean, this is a map that is 40 years ahead of its time, and I think in many ways very accurate. They claim that in the center of this Pacific continent of Mu was this huge high mountain, Mauna Loa, which is in fact the highest mountain in the world if you go from the base of the mountain to the top. Most of Mauna Loa right now is the main island of Hawaii, and the majority of this island is underwater. They claimed that there were these 13 or 12 valleys and huge mountain ranges that fanned out from the huge Mauna Loa, central mountain of the continent, and that the various races of mankind developed in the Pacific, isolated in each of the valleys. This was essentially their explanation, and Churchward had said the same thing, of how different races of mankind developed. We're all humans, Homo sapiens, but have these different racial characteristics because of the isolated valleys of Mu. They actually called the continent Makulia. Other names for this lost continent Pacific have been Rutas. The Easter Islanders call their lost continent Hiva. Some people today also call it Pacifica, a modern name. Lemuria is also a modern geological name. And another name for this lost continent, which is in the Awaspi book, they call it Pan. Churchward's explanation for how these cataclysms, the sinking of Mu, the sinking of Atlantis, the cataclysmic destruction of ancient civilizations, had to do with pole shifts. And he was one of the first people to theorize on pole shifts. Let's see. Here we go. According to Churchward, what would happen, and other authors have expanded on this, there would be, the Earth is constantly, needs to be in equilibrium. And one of the things that causes the destabilization of the Earth is ice caps. When you have ice at the poles, at one or both the poles, the Earth starts to get destabilized. The Earth wobbles anyway. It has does not spin perfectly. It has what's called a Chandler wobble. And eventually, according to Churchward, Hugh Slush Brown, Edgar Casey, other people like that, the Earth will eventually, as it becomes unstable, will lurch forward 10, 20 degrees. One way I like to explain a pole shift, just to draw an analogy, is if you take a raw egg and put it on a table and then spin that egg, then stop it. Just stop the egg from spinning, and now take your hand away from it again. What will happen? The egg will start to spin again, because you've only stopped momentarily the thin shell of the egg while the core of the egg is still spinning. This is then analogous to a pole shift. The thin crust of the Earth moves on the inner core, but the inner core of the Earth keeps spinning and doesn't really change. But the Earth's crust moves around to gain equilibrium. For instance, this would be one explanation for woolly mammoths that are flash frozen in Siberia. At one point, they're happily eating buttercups in a relatively moderate climate, when suddenly they find themselves at the North Pole. Most of the ivory that was found in the 1800s and used for piano keys and billiard balls didn't come from African elephants. It came from huge piles of ivory and bones that are found in Siberia and Alaska. If you go in Siberia and Alaska, there are literally mountains of crushed mammoth bones and ivory and woolly rhinos and giant elk. And these animals were just grazing in these huge plains when suddenly a giant wave came and hit them, washed them all up, pulverized them, and then washed them into these mountains that are today in the Arctic. It's really, the idea of a pole shift is another explanation for what traditional archaeologists, the uniformitarian geologists who are, and it's their theories we learn today, talk about ice ages. The whole idea these ice ages occur, big sheets of ice come down from the North Pole and the South Pole or wherever and cover areas of the Earth and then recede. Well, one of the problems with ice ages that most geologists do not talk about is this. You had, during the last so-called ice age, say 10,000 BC or so, you had giant ice sheets coming down into Wisconsin and central Illinois, where I live today. And so they say, yeah, well, this is all part of this last ice age and the ice caps coming down from the North Pole. What they don't tell you is that at Baffin Island, which is in northern Canada, there was no ice sheet, and in fact, there was a huge redwood forest that is today, the remnants are still there, and it's like a petrified forest. And this is from 10,000 BC. At the same time that these glaciers were in Wisconsin and Illinois, you had in Alaska giant herds of woolly rhinos and woolly mammoths running around. So now you have an anomaly of ice, giant ice caps in, say, Wisconsin and Illinois, but north of that, you don't have ice, and in fact you have some temperate forest. Well, how do you explain that? I mean, they don't. They just, again, this is typical of archaeologists and geologists. If something doesn't fit into their prevailing theories, they just discard it and ignore it. Well, the reason you can have a forest in Baffin Island and an ice sheet in Wisconsin is that the North Pole wasn't where it is today. And the Earth had shifted around. The North Pole probably at that time was in the Hudson Bay area. This is anyway, the explanation for pole shifts. Similarly, there are maps that exist. They're in some of my books. The famous Piri Reis map, which is today in the Topkapi Museum, and is a map that dates from the early 1500s. That map shows sections of Antarctica ice-free. And that map is probably drawn from older maps that are from, I'll just guess, from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 BC, something like that. Today, there's more than a mile thick of ice in Antarctica. The statistics you read on Antarctica are astonishing. They say that there's more than 90% of all the fresh water on Earth is ice in Antarctica. Ice accumulates in Antarctica at a rate of like 1 billion tons a day, something like that. That ice sheet is also lopsided. Something else too that's interesting to note, when you have a greenhouse effect and a general warming of the Earth, this does not melt ice caps. In fact, ice caps become bigger when the Earth heats up. And the reason is because the equatorial areas of the Earth heat up first, and the ocean areas around the equator, there's more condensation of water from the oceans. That water then goes to the poles and where it snows and becomes ice. Now, back in the 70s, there was an archaeologist in the University of Texas. His name was Dr. David Zink. He became big on the giant underwater stones of Bimini off of Florida. And those stones, he later wrote a book called The Stones of Atlantis. He became this believer in Atlantis. Well, one thing that happens, if you're an academic teaching at some university in the United States and you suddenly start believing in Atlantis, you're out of a job. They'll strip you of your job, and they'll make sure that you can't get a job at any university. And this is very much what happened to him. I met him in the mid-'80s. He was down and out and managing some apartment building in Los Angeles. Now, in a book that he wrote called The Ancient Stones Speak in 1979, he then published this world grid map. It's a pretty famous one. It's in our book, Anti-Gravity and the World Grid. So you'll notice here, Easter Island would be grid point 47 on this map. And this is the other side of the world. Grid point number 28, right over here, is Ponape, the island of the Crystal City we were just looking at. It's interesting that when I was on that island, people told me that that island is never hit by typhoons. The reason that island is never hit by typhoons, they say, is because it's there at that island that the typhoons start. The typhoons start at that island, a major vortex area on the planet, and from the island themselves, they begin going out across the Pacific, hit places like Guam or the Philippines or Taiwan, wiping them out. But the island itself is relatively secure from typhoons simply because it's where they start. You'll notice over here that grid point number 1 on this map, Zink's map, is the pyramids at Giza. And down here, grid point number 44 is in South Australia. And I believe that that grid point is actually the Maralinga atomic test site. So this is one thing they discovered, was that as they plotted major intersections on the grid, vortex areas, they found that there were megalithic sites there. Where there weren't megalithic sites, or in some cases, both, the military began using them. Military bases were placed on some of these spots, or, as in the case of grid point 44, for whatever reason, atomic testing was done. Now, one of the things, here's one way that the Earth grid is created. By the way, there are different kinds of grids. Bruce Cathie, the New Zealander, writes all those books, a friend of mine. His grid is different than this one. This is not the same as Bruce Cathie's grid. His is a light harmonic grid. This one is more just an electromagnetic grid on the Earth. Now here we can see, first of all, the old concept of magnetism, if you look at the top left drawing, is that you have with the bar magnet, you have a north pole and a south pole with the magnetic field running basically from one pole to the other. They've basically discarded this theory of magnetism now for what is the new concept of what is called a block wall in the center of the magnet. In other words, there is a null zone in the middle of the magnet, and the field from either pole meets in the center and doesn't actually go all the way. And so you have an equator. The block wall, which is spelled B-L-O-C-H, is this null zone, like the doldrums of the equator. So therefore, we can see in this lower drawing here how the Earth's magnetic fields create, rather than just going from the North Pole to the South Pole, they meet in the center, and this complex magnetic fields then crisscross and create a grid pattern throughout the Earth. where the fields cross, these lines, these magnetic field lines, you're then supposedly going to get one of these power spots, one of these vortex areas, where you're going to get either an upward vortex or a downward vortex. The Russians, too, had their energy grid model. They treated the Earth as like a giant crystal, where the facets of the crystal energy will run along. Same concept of the grids. Where they cross, you're going to have these power points. The bottom illustration is of a carbon-60 molecule. You can see how these grid concepts really work even on an atomic level. Carbon is basically what all life on this planet is based on, carbon. So we have, even ourselves, our atomic structure is some kind of geometric grid pattern. One of my heroes as a kid was Buckminster Fuller. Fuller was inventor of the geodesic domes. He believed that oil companies and energy companies were controlling the world. Famous quote from Buckminster Fuller about the energy crisis in the 70s was, he said, "Well, there is no energy crisis, there's just a crisis of ignorance." Buckminster Fuller, curiously, at one point, he had used, back in the 30s, he lived in Chicago, and he had used a lot of his wife's relatives' money for his various inventions and schemes, had lost all that money and was very depressed, and he was going to commit suicide. He was going to jump off the dock in Lake Michigan and kill himself, and he was standing there on the dock, getting ready to do it, when suddenly he had this voice in his head said, "Oh, Buckminster Fuller, don't kill yourself. You know, you have many important things to do for planet Earth. You know, your inventions will work out. You're going to be famous. You know, don't give up in despair." And Buckminster Fuller sort of stopped and said, "Wow, okay, maybe I won't kill myself." And continued, and he persevered, and eventually he came up with his geodesic domes, his grid maps. He was one of the first. He drew his Dymaxion map, where he also treated the world as a grid. He wrote a book called Utopia or Oblivion. One of Buckminster Fuller books too, Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth. He also countered the popular philosophy that there's not enough food in the world, there's not enough resources, there's this population bomb, that kind of thing. All these people, we can't live together. To Buckminster Fuller, that was total malarkey. Buckminster Fuller was very much an advocate of the abundant Earth. There's more than enough on this planet for everyone, for all the Earth, and I very much believe that too. It's just that we don't live in harmony with the Earth, and we spend most of our money and resources on weapons and destructive things. Now, back to grid point 44, South Australia. The British government back in the 50s decided that they were going to detonate this atom bomb there at grid point number 44. So they sent a South Australian explorer, his name was Len Beadle, to go out to that grid point. And they didn't just tell Len Beadle, they just say, well, Len, go out and find some empty spot in the desert where we can detonate our bomb. No, they told Len Beadle to go to this place. They said, here is where we want to detonate our bomb. Go there and find out what's there. And that became later known as the Emu test site. This is a map to it. Now, when Len Beadle got to the place where the British said they wanted to test their atom bomb, he found ancient structures there. He found these stacked stones. Notice the large lichen patches on them. Haven't been there. Whoops. Didn't mean to do that. He didn't. What he discovered were these ancient sites. Stacked stones. These may be basalt crystals. Don't really know. In the back is a platform of cut stone blocks. I don't have any slides to show you the back of this platform, but these are cut blocks fitted together. I got this photograph from Bruce Cathie, who got it from Len Beadle. Len Beadle himself took this photo in the 50s. The site is now radioactive, I guess. You cannot go there. Curiously, I mean, the British didn't seem to care that there was some ancient site at the Maralinga atomic test site. They just decided they were going to explode a bomb anyway. According to Bruce Cathie, the testing of atomic weapons and other special military facilities are always specially located on the Earth and not just haphazardly or where cheap land is or something like that. He claims that there's always a harmonic grid value placed there, and that each of these facilities has some special function, particularly atomic test sites. So Easter Island 2 is definitely a major vortex area on the planet, a very mysterious place. Now, throughout Easter Island are giant statues. And now, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that most of the statues on Easter Island are placed along the edge of the island and are all looking inward. Statues are 60 to 80 feet high. They're carved out of a volcanic rock in the center of the island called Rama. The statues, according to the Easter Islanders, were imbued with a power, and eyes were placed inside the statue's eyes in the sockets, and from these eyes radiated a power. To the Easter Islanders, they called this power mana, and it was an occult power that protected the island and kept the island from sinking under the ocean, they claimed. The Easter Islanders, too, have legends of a lost continent. They say that Easter Island was once part of this large continent. They called it Hiva, H-I-V-A. And this large continent then sank into the ocean, like Churchward and Lemurian Fellowship said, sank into the ocean 20,000 years ago or something like that. And Easter Island, they said, was like the fulcrum. And only it remained above the water, although no doubt other islands did too. All the statues are created in a quarry in the center of the island called Rama. Easter Island is a small island actually, and is a triangle. There's a volcano at each corner of the triangle. As you go up into the center volcano, which is like the fourth one, as you go up into the crater, this is what you find. You find a natural amphitheater and a Totoro reed lake. Now, Totoro reeds are the reeds that are used for building these reed boats, the same reeds that are found at Lake Titicaca in Peru. They're also found in the marshes of Iraq and ancient Babylon, in Lothal, also in Morocco and Egypt. The Totoro reeds are what Thor Heyerdahl would build his boats out of to go sailing around the world across the Pacific or the Atlantic, proving ancient sailors. Now the thing is, with the amphitheater at Rama, what happens is you have all these statues. Now this is where the other statues are. Aside from the statues that are around the edge of the island, all looking inside, protecting the island, these statues are all sitting on the inside of the crater, and they're all facing down. In other words, if you're standing in this natural amphitheater here, particularly right down by the lake, you're standing there and you're looking at about 100 giant statues who are all staring straight at you. It's a very interesting experience. You're standing there, these giant statues, they're buried up to their chins in sediment, and they're staring straight at you. Now, right up at the top, right up here, in this is a carved stone room. And in that room are 7 carved seats. Now, supposedly, according to the Easter Islanders, 7 masters would sit in these seats. And you can look out over the island, and they used a ball, what was a giant stone ball. It's now on one edge of the shore. And supposedly they would look through that ball and use that ball and their mind power to make the statues walk around the island. The amphitheater itself was very much like this amphitheater, I believe, like an ancient meeting place where initiates from all over the world would meet, come to the island. Notice here again how, like this statue over here, I mean, this is only about a third of the statue. The rest of him is buried underground. And if he wasn't purposely buried, These statues are so old that just 30 feet of sediment has accumulated just in the many thousands of years that they've been standing there. Giant lichen patches on the statues. A few of them are toppled over. This is the traditional way that it's said that the statues are built. Traditional in the sense of traditional archaeologists. This is not what the Easter Islanders say. Basically, they drag the statues around. If you're on Easter Island, generally what the Chilean government has put up of the way that they moved the statues was that they lay them on their stomachs and then rocked them, kind of tied like a sled on either side of them, basically rocked them around the island. This is not what the Easter Islanders say, of course. Recently, Thor Heyerdahl has written a book called Easter Island, The Mystery Solved, where he says that the way that they moved the statues was basically the way a person walks a refrigerator, kind of tipping it while it's standing up, tipping it to one side and then moving it forward. I know Thor Heyerdahl personally, and I've talked to him about this. It's not a very unique theory. In fact, it was by a French guy who had written a book back in the 70s saying exactly the same thing. It was in my book, Lost Cities of Ancient Lemuria in the Pacific, before Thor Heyerdahl's book. He seemed to think this was a very original theory and put it in his book, Easter Island Mystery Solved. But that is not what the Easter Islanders say. Now here's their explanation of how the statues moved around the island, and that is that they were levitated. Now this is an ancient, this is two maps in one. It's an old map of the roads on Easter Island, and then I've added some diagrams myself. Now, according to the Easter Islanders, the statues all came out of the Ranu crater right here in this part of the island. Now, according to them, the statues had to walk in a clockwise spiral around the island. The ancient roads of the island do exactly that. They move out from the crater and they begin moving in a clockwise pattern and move around and go around this volcano here, the largest mountain on the island, which is called Rano Arroy. Now on Rano Arroy, there is an anomalous magnetic field there. If you get a hiking map of the island, it actually will list this magnetic field there. It says anomalous magnetic field. When I was hiking around the island, I took out my compass. My compass was going crazy right around in that area. And in fact, when Jacques Cousteau and the Calypso were at Easter Island filming one of Jacques Cousteau's documentaries, his son, Philippe, had an ultralight on the Calypso. Now, Philippe was then going to fly this ultralight around Easter Island. And the islanders warned him. They said, be careful flying your ultralight, particularly around this volcano, because your instruments will all go haywire and you'll crash. Well, Philippe ignored them, got in his ultralight, flew around the Rano Arroy volcano. His instruments did go crazy, and he did crash. He was almost killed. He had to be flown to a hospital in Santiago where they saved his life. No doubt Jacques was very upset that his son was almost killed. He'd already lost one son. So, yeah, there is a very anomalous magnetic field here. So the statues, according to them, the Easter Islanders had to move the statues in this clockwise vortex around the island, around the anomalous magnetic field, and then come, say, to this spot. So just to show you what I'm saying, the statues are all coming here from the Ranu crater, and some of the statues were like right here, just to the north side of the island. However, even though this was maybe only a kilometer or two from here to there, according to the Easter Islanders, they couldn't walk a statue from here right to there. They would have to literally walk the statue all the way along here, would have to come here, up around the volcano, around here, to get to this point. That's what they say. So somehow, I believe that this is true. They're saying that they levitated the statues, and these 7 guys sitting in these seats were part of all that, and then they would use the natural vortex of the island, and then probably the crystalline structure of the rock that the statues are built out of. They would cause the statues to be weightless, and the statues would then levitate, literally like drift in this spiral vortex around the island. This is pretty much how I think that the stones were levitated at Namadal. The stones were magnetic, they were crystals. By introducing a field, a sort of null gravitational field on there, an anti-gravity, if you will, a vibration, the stones would lose their weight and be weightless. In fact, on Ponape, the islanders have this legend that people would actually ride on the stones as ballast to keep the stones from floating too high up in the air. Now, one of the reasons I've said here to the mysterious moai high in the cliffs is because this area, this volcano here, Rano Kau, is almost perfectly straight cliffs that go down for like a couple of 100 feet straight down into the water. Well, one thing the archaeologists had trouble figuring out was how they would get the statues, moai, that's what they would call them, how they would get them onto these cliffs. And some of these statues were actually perched high on these cliffs, these sheer cliffs. And they were, I mean, the traditional archaeologists, their whole explanation was, well, of course, they just wrestled these statues into place. They didn't have anything else to do on the island. But how they got them onto these high cliffs, they really couldn't explain that. But if the islanders had done what they said, moving them by levitation, essentially, then yeah, I mean, then they could get them onto these high cliffs.
Check, see.
Okay, the men were sitting in this crater here. The source of all the statues came from this source right here, Ranu Raraku crater. So in other words, okay, Easter Island is like a triangle of 3 volcanoes, one here, and one here, and a 4th, smaller volcano here. Not the center of the island, but in this area, right in here. Throughout Easter Island, too, there are weird caves. And I've crawled into a few myself. Particularly in this area are caves in the cliffs. There are the Rongo tablets and other things are kept there. There's a certain danger, they say, of taking anything from Easter Island, in that the spirits of Easter Island do not like things to be taken. Okay, this is the very unusual wall of Vinapu, also on Easter Island. Notice how it is perfectly cut and fitted megalithic blocks, huge lichen patches. The wall has a certain concave look to it. The stones are kind of rounded. You can see again the wall, it's like a platform, the beginnings of a step pyramid or whatever. Again, large lichen patches. You can see sort of the rounded face slightly. Here too, the stones are so perfectly fitted together that you cannot slip a knife or a piece of paper through it. They fit together, and it's done in something of a jigsaw puzzle too, where the stones are interlocked. You can even see here how the edges of the stone are all fitted together on the other side, and even this little keystone is put in, a little small triangle, also perfectly fitted in there. This kind of construction is exactly the same kind of construction you see in South America, in the Andes Mountains in Peru and Bolivia. This is a wall from Ollanta Tambo in Peru, near to Machu Picchu. See again the way it's virtually identical to the type of construction at Easter Island. Giant blocks of stone, perfectly fitted. Slightly jigsaw puzzle. There was a certain roundedness. Notice too, large lichen patches eating the stone. This is really, I usually call this Atlantean construction. It's the most highly skilled and best construction technique in the world. And it is one of the only construction techniques that will withstand giant earthquakes. what happens is an earthquake hits walls like this. The walls are tied in together. There is no mortar or anything. And the walls will move with the earthquake, but because they're locked in, will generally fall back into place. Here we go. This is one of the reed boats on Lake Titicaca. Just like on Easter Island, they use the same kind of ships. When you build boats out of these Tortora reeds, they're unsinkable. I mean, even if the whole ship disintegrated, this happened to Thor Heyerdahl several times, you can even just grab any piece of the boat and you'll float. You can't sink them. This is a statue from Chavin, also on the coast of Peru. I threw this in there because it looks a lot like a kind of Easter Island statue. Notice the big nose, and the bridge of the nose goes way back towards the forehead. He's wearing like a diadem thing around his head. Okay, back to Easter Island. The only other place on Easter Island where you have the statues. You have the statues that are all ringed around the outside of the island, looking in, protecting the island from sinking. You have the statues in the crater, in the amphitheater, which are all looking down to the lake. And then you have these 7 statues, which are separate. They're in the middle of the island, and they're staring out towards the southeast, towards Antarctica. They are apparently the representatives of the 7 so-called masters who would meet on the island and allegedly move the stones. All the statues on the island, by the way, except for the ones in the crater that are buried up to their chins, most of the statues that were along the edge of the island were destroyed. At one time in Easter Island, there was this civil war between the so-called long ears and the short ears. And after this war, all the statues were, in a sense, killed. And what they did was, they would take statues and they would execute them by doing this. They would place a large stone so that when they would push the statue over, and as it fell, its neck would hit a large stone and its neck would break. And that was part of their thing, to attempt to break the necks of the statues. Because the statues had this power in them. They were alive. Even today in Tahiti and in the Marquesas, many of the giant statues there, antiques, still are alive. And you cannot get Tahitians, particularly if they're from that island, to touch or move these statues. They're afraid they'll die because the statues have a power in them, Vimana. So on Easter Island, there was actually some deliberate attempt to destroy the power and, in a sense, kill these statues. These statues were along the edge of the island, also looking in. Okay, I'll go over this slide briefly, which is a slide with Adventures Unlimited. One of our things was always to search out weird ruins in the jungle, lost cities, all that kind of thing. And we were sent this photograph from Guatemala. This photograph originally appeared in the Ancient Astronaut Society newsletter. It was just a small little photograph. Once we saw it, we immediately wanted to track this thing down and find out where it was. Notice how it looks similar to an Easter Island statue. There's people sitting at the top. You have also the guy standing by the car there at the bottom. I'm told that's a 1938 Ford. You can even, if you look carefully, you can see even eyelashes there on the face. It's interesting to think that maybe this statue was buried, much like Easter Island statues, and there could be another, 100 feet of that statue underground. Who knows? We'll get into this a little bit more on our search for that statue. This is the Nazca Plain in Peru. That's also a vortex area on Zinc's map. This is an aerial photo. You can't really see anything on this plane unless you're flying in an airplane. Notice how it's often said to be some kind of ancient runway for ancient sites and things like that, moving along. Notice here, vortex spiral on the plane. Lots of lines, all edged across. Also many figures like monkeys and spiders and condors. Maria Reike, who was a German anthropologist who's done most of the work at Nazca, she believes that Nazca, well, an element of Nazca anyway, is that it's a giant astronomical chart. I think that's part of the explanation. Nazca is many, many things on one thing on top of each other. The giant trapezoids, it's interesting, when you're in the plane, the small planes flying over, at one point, the pilot will actually pretend to land on one of these trapezoids. It does look like a runway. Although I don't really think these were runways myself, just my own explanation, although I do think they were meant to be viewed from the air. The making of the lines in Nazca is not so hard to do. They basically just scraped off this darker layer of the Earth, it's very rocky there, to expose this lighter underlayer. But now one of the mysteries of Nazca, these weird geometrical shapes, the vortex patterns, also the astronomical symbols on there, is that some of the lines, they have these perfectly straight lines that go throughout the plane, and these lines go for hundreds of miles perfectly straight through the Andes. One interesting explanation that I was given about Nazca by some Peruvians one time is that the shamans of Peru would, in some of their ceremonies, they use a hallucinogenic cactus called San Pedro cactus. There's also in the Amazon a bush called ayahuasca, and they would use, both of these are highly hallucinogenic drugs, and when you take San Pedro or ayahuasca, you immediately go into like a trance, and you're launched astrally, and you're like flying. And one person explained to me with the Nazca plane was that one of the reasons for these etchings and different figures, just one explanation, is that these brujos, these shamans, when they would take the San Pedro cactus, one of their tests was they would have to fly over the Nazca plain in their astral body, and then look down, and then later tell their teacher what they had seen, and describe it correctly, that kind of thing. So now, in the Nazca plain, what we've got here are these straight lines. These straight lines would go for hundreds of miles through the Andes. Now, they're like a trail, but you cannot follow these trails. When these lines would come to obstacles like boulders and cliffs and things, the lines, instead of going around these obstacles, go perfectly straight over them. The lines are absolutely straight. You could not follow the line. When you came to some boulder or cliff, you'd have to walk around it. Yet the line is going straight over it. And it's just like etched into the mountainside. I believe that these lines are actually, either are now or were at the time, mapping energy currents, ley lines, through the Earth. The lines at Nazca some of them go for hundreds of miles through the Andes. Nazca is near the coast, and they go to Tiahuanaco. Tiahuanaco is in the Altiplano. It's 13,000 feet in the Andes. It's near Lake Titicaca. Today it's part of Bolivia. Okay, so what do you find at Tiahuanaco? You find an incredibly ancient city that is megalithic in size and has been destroyed in a cataclysm. Notice how the giant blocks of stone here fitted together it's built out of andesite, one of the hardest blocks of stone known. It's a granite type rock, crystalline in structure. You have these giant statues at Tiahuanaco. The statue weighs probably about 50 tons, 40 tons maybe. Stands about 25 feet high. It's carved out of andesite, very hard rock. Notice how he's holding in his hands two kind of oddball things. Nobody's quite sure what those are. Artifacts, could be a jade scepter, could be like a knife or a sword. Might be even some kind of weird high-tech gizmo. He seems to be wearing a turban. Atlanteans supposedly wore turbans. They would knot turbans. They would wear like a knotted turban in the front. This is the famous Gate of the Sun. It's also carved out of andesite, weighs about 100 tons. It has been said it's been cracked in a huge earthquake. It's one of the few things that was left standing at Tiahuanaco. It has been said that these hieroglyphs around the outside, around on the face here, some people believe that that's a Venusian calendar of Venus. Now in the center there is what they call the sun god. Now of course this gate would have had other giant blocks all fitted next to it. Here is the close-up of the sun god. Notice how he's wearing a feathered headdress, much like American Indian chiefs were wont to do. He's got two scepters on either hand, and he is crying. There are tears coming down his eyes here. It's said that he's crying for Atlantis or Mu, crying for the lost land. This is what it looks like on the Altiplano today. Very bleak. It's cold and windswept. It's also the home of the potato, where the potato came from. It's really, it's a pretty bleak place to live. You have 20,000-foot mountains ringing the area. This is the gate of the sun, or gate of the moon, more hieroglyphs undeciphered at the top, another gate. Notice how on either side here you have these notches there. Those notches are also to fit more giant blocks in. It's a way of fitting these giant blocks together and interlocking these massive stones so that they would be earthquake-proof. Now, about a mile away from the Tiahuanaco, there's also a pyramid at Tiahuanaco that's been mainly destroyed. There's a very strange site called Pumapunku. Now, some people, like Churchward, claimed that Pumapunku was also the remains of an ancient sea-level canal that went from the Pacific to the Amazon Sea. Okay. At Pumapunku, when archaeologists would start digging, under about 15 feet, anywhere from probably 7 to 15 feet of mud and sludge and dirt, whenever they start digging, and this is all fairly recent too, just within the last few years, they would uncover these giant blocks of stone. The whole city has been wiped out in a giant tidal wave and earthquake. The stones are highly articulated, they're cut, they have, it's a very hard stone. Here you see what are called keystone cuts. It's a very unusual way of fitting together megalithic blocks of stone. What they do is in a keystone cut, you have stones, there are actually 3 blocks of stone here, and then on one side of a block of stone, you cut a cut to put a clamp in. Sometimes these are hourglass shaped, other times they come straight out and then they flange out. You can see the same thing on the other side. These are called keystone cuts, and what happens is a metal clamp goes in there. A clamp either made out of copper or out of silver or out of some gold alloy is placed in the cuts there, and it holds the blocks together. This is an extremely unusual way of fitting megalithic blocks together. And you find exactly this same technique at the megalithic sites in ancient Egypt. If you tour ancient Egypt and you see where a lot of the giant statues have been placed together, that kind of things, you'll see exactly the same kind of technique. It's impossible that a technique like this would have developed separately in different parts of the world. This is the slide that was missing before. I just wanted to show you so you can really get an idea of what this is like. Gigantic stone blocks, perfectly cutted, weighing up to 100,000 pounds, 200,000 pounds. Huge, huge building blocks. It's when you're there, you just can hardly believe it. These people built buildings to last, buildings to withstand huge earthquakes, and the buildings are just destroyed. I mean, they're like some kids' building blocks that have just been smashed and thrown out. Some huge cataclysm has taken place here. And what people like Churchward claimed was that, okay, here now, and as you dig, everywhere that you dig, you suddenly find more of these giant blocks. Some huge tidal wave has occurred. What they say is that at one point, South America was down as a continental plate, was depressed. And then there was this upheaval. It was the sinking of the Pacific continent, probably in a pole shift. And then Lake Titicaca, which at that time was sea level, was uplifted and is now at 13,000 feet in the Andes. This is an aerial photo of Lake Titicaca, and these are the islands of the sun. Lake Titicaca is very deep. It is the site of a lot of mysteries. A lot of UFOs are seen around Lake Titicaca. UFOs are seen coming out of the water there. There are underwater ruins at Lake Titicaca. In my book on South America, which we don't have here, we've got photographs of underwater ruins that are found there, like the giant ruins that are also found above water. The sacred islands of the sun, like these, were sacred to the Incas, a very more recent civilization. There are tunnels that go underwater. Here you can see the edge of the land going out into out into the Altiplano. There are seahorses in Lake Titicaca. Lake Titicaca was at one time apparently a saltwater lake, was attached to the ocean, and then over time, as it was lifted up into the Andes, fresh water drained into the lake, springs were coming up, and over many thousands of years, the water in Lake Titicaca went from saltwater to freshwater. The seahorses in Lake Titicaca adapted to this, and there is another lake in central Bolivia called Lake Popo, and this lake is a saltwater lake. It's like all the salt formerly from Lake Titicaca went into this lake. Here you can see again the reed boats, reed houses. These are reed islands on the lake. There's a tribe of Indians that lives on the lake. They live in these reed houses and they fish. A lot of their income now is from tourism, although tourism to Peru has kind of come to a halt, actually. These are the mountains around Lake Titicaca and La Paz, about 21,000 foot peaks. Now, curiously, there's a very unusual site in eastern Bolivia called Samaipata, El Fuerte, a place of giants. They found giant bones, and it's on top of this mountain here. And what's up there is very weird foundations of some city. And it's megalithic, it's carved into solid rock, yet the walls and other pieces are gone. Here you can see how the rock is carved. Look at the large lichen patches. Weird channels are carved straight into the solid rock going up towards the hill. The strange crisscross pattern. One of Eric von Daniken's books, he got to this site. He thought that this was some kind of rocket launching pad for extraterrestrials. I doubt if that is the solution myself. Rather, it is a very interesting thing. It does seem like it's something for machinery. It's like a railway track or something like carved in there, and a machinery, for instance, like giant cannons and things like that in World War II were often put into sort of artificial mini railways like that to move up and down. All right, moving around that city, the Samaipata, this one that's giant, been wiped out. All the main blocks are there. Only the foundations of the buildings are left. There is a very unusual thing there, and that is this tunnel. And we went there. I've been there several times. What happens is, it's a place they call the Chincana, and you go down into the jungle nearby there, and suddenly you're at this tunnel entrance. And I've always been interested in ancient tunnels, passages through the earth, that kind of thing. And what you have is, at this site, here's what it's like. You go down into this pit, and it goes down about 20 feet, and you're suddenly standing there. It's like straight down. You would need ropes or a ladder to go down there, and you're now standing in this tunnel. And this tunnel is about 8 feet high and 6 feet wide. 2 people can walk in it abreast. And the tunnel, it's near the top of this mountain. This tunnel then begins moving down into the earth. This tunnel goes, we don't know where it goes exactly. It seems to go a long distance. Bolivian archaeologists have gone into this tunnel to try and find out where it goes. It's not blocked or anything. The tunnel actually moves and starts going downhill. The Bolivian archaeologists had to turn back after a couple hundred meters into this tunnel because the air became so stale. They felt they would need to take oxygen and breathing equipment to go down inside it. I have been inside one of the tunnels in Brazil, not this one. Now, asking the caretaker, I asked him, I said, well, explain this tunnel to me. And he said, well, I mean, we can't explain it. It just seems to go down into the earth. It's just carved down through the mountains. He said to me, then pointed to this mountain across the valley about 20 miles away. This is a photo taken with a telephoto lens. And he pointed to this mountain up here, and he said, the archaeologists believe that tunnel goes to this mountain. And they call this mountain the Devil's Dimple, El Moche de Diablo. And he said, yeah, they think there's some kind of lost city over there, and this tunnel goes over there to that place, and this tunnel comes out. And this would be a tunnel going down, starting from nearly the top of this mountain, going down to the bottom of the mountain, underneath a river, then 20 miles underneath other rivers and mountains, and then to this place. Tunnels do exist all through South America. We went on one of our expeditions to this mountain to try and find these other tunnel entrances and the lost cities. We were not able to find anything there, though we spent several days hiking around in that area. Okay, that is the last slide of this tray, and we'll take a break right now, I think. Duncan is sailing me over there. And then we'll come back, and we'll go a little bit more into South America and the structures there. And then after lunch, we'll get into pyramids on Mars and the moon and UFOs. We'll have some questions then, too, later. So we'll take a break, about a 10-minute break. This is the lost city of Machu Picchu, high in the Andes Mountains and the Urubamba River. Fantastic place. Maybe a few of you have been there. It's really, I think, one of the great sites in the world. It is, with Rio de Janeiro, I think, the 2 most popular tourist destinations. And Machu Picchu is like a secret city. It's a megalithic city. It's not built by the Incas, although the Incas may have lived there, although there's even evidence that possibly the Incas themselves never even really used Machu Picchu. But like many of these giant cities, let's use Machu Picchu as an example, because they're built to last, and they're built at these megalithic stones, they really do last for thousands of years. And so now if you're like a wandering tribe and you come through some valley, this is, I think, the story of many lost cities, ancient civilizations, and you suddenly find a city. There's nobody living in it, but all these giant walls are right there and everything, and you go, wow, here's a nice city. We'll just put a roof on some of the buildings. We'll have our own city. And this is really what's happened a lot, I think, in South America. Okay. This is a Landsat 2 satellite photo of the eastern jungles of Peru, the Madre de Dios area. Let's see, try and focus that a little bit. There we go, let's get a little sharper. Back a little bit. Whoa, too much of that. All right, here we go. Slightly. There's also a way to do that. All right, this is a Landsat 2 photograph of the eastern jungles of South America. What it shows is Madre de Dios jungles east of the Andes. Now, if you look into this area right here, you see what are 8 pyramids in the jungle. Now, these pyramids are pretty mysterious. Several expeditions have tried to get to these pyramids. Some of them have just totally vanished, and the explorers were never seen again. Only one person ever that we know of got to these pyramids right in here. And he was a Japanese explorer, and the reason he could get to these pyramids is that the Indians who live in the jungle in this area, Machiganga Indians, look and speak almost exactly like Japanese. They look like Japanese, their language is much like Japanese, and this Japanese explorer looks just like them. So they were curious of him, and they allowed him into this area. Now, when the Spanish conquered the Inca Empire about 1530 or so, what happened was, it's a very unusual bit of history where the Inca Empire, which was just finishing a civil war at the time, was conquered by a couple of hundred Spanish. And they did this by kidnapping Atahualpa, who was the Inca emperor at the time, and they held him for ransom for a room full of gold and a room full of silver. The Incas paid this ransom from Cuzco and from the Sun Temple there. The Incas had a lot of gold and metals, but they did not use coinage. Metals and gold were used. They literally wallpapered houses and things like that with it. They paid this ransom, which was to them almost like a ransom of pots and pans or something. And then, but typical of the conquistadors, they didn't keep their promise. After the ransom was paid, they executed the emperor and then marched on to take Cuzco, the capital. Now, essentially, by executing the Inca king and then putting in their own Inca puppet ruler, they now were in control. But now the Incas themselves, realizing what was going on, decided they had to get they had to remove the treasure. And they took the treasure out of this Temple of the Sun, and they moved it to a secret city, which is still undiscovered today, a city called Paititi. This is Ollantaytambo, also in the Urubamba Valley. Okay. Just go on to the next slide. Right? Here we are, Machu Picchu. Here you can see some of the giant blocks of stone. Huge blocks here. The whole thing's been split by an earthquake. This middle is standing right here. You can see also how the whole thing is coming down. This is in Machu Picchu, the secret city. Machu Picchu is interesting too, because as you come up the Urubamba Valley to Machu Picchu, you cannot see the city. The city itself is hidden in the mountains. Here you see the different doors. Again, the giant construction, huge blocks of stone, large lichen patches. Notice up here the different levels of construction. Beautiful construction up here, but now right above it is like kind of crummy little stone blocks and mud fill just to fill it in. Always the better construction is the older one that's there on top. Now we began ourselves, okay, here again, you can focus this. Here again you can see more gigantic blocks of stone. This is at Ollantaytambo. Now what's interesting about this is the different levels of construction. Now the traditional archaeologists say, well, this city was built by the Incas. And we have here, what you can see is giant blocks of stone. I mean, these things are about the size of a truck or something like that. You can see them here again, large lichen patches. But what have they done? How the fill between the blocks now are these small stones with mud brick kind of things, mud plaster. Obviously, we're looking at two different periods of construction. The one is the earlier period of giant stone blocks. These blocks are like tossed around, they've been wiped out. And then at a later period, Incas, or even a previous culture than that, has come in, taken these giant blocks of stone that are now toppled, and filled them in with a more primitive type of construction. Now, Paititi, the ancient city in the Andes, should be something similar. Here again. Now, this is archaeological anomalies that are just never addressed by the traditional archaeological community. Again, giant stone blocks here. This is also Ollantaytambo, near to Machu Picchu. Huge I mean, this is a 100,000-ton block of stone, giant, these squared. Now look how underneath. I mean, this whole thing has been, again, destroyed in a huge earthquake, but look at these smaller rocks underneath here. Well, this obviously was not the way this block of stone was originally intended to be. It somehow fell over, and then the Incas then built up this more crummy construction just out of small stones underneath it. It's obvious what's going on here, but the traditional archaeologists ignore this. According to them, the Incas built all this about 600 years ago. Doesn't make sense. Okay, here again, a keystone cut at Ollantaytambo, the same as we were showing at Tiahuanaco, the same as appear in ancient Egypt. Here, there is not the corresponding stone to go in there. There's only one side of the keystone cut. Another giant block must have been originally fitted here with a corresponding keystone cut on the other side. These blocks are made out of andesite. Okay, here you can another close-up of the keystone cut. Some of the blocks, they came from aquaria up above on a mountain up above here, and they weigh, some of the blocks of stone, they're all kind of squared, are the size of a freight train. Now what we did, what I did for many years, I would go, in the late 80s, I would go several times a year to Peru, and we ran expeditions into the remote jungles. We followed ancient Inca roads and headed into the lower jungles of Peru in search of what was called Paititi, this city where the lost treasure of the Incas was kept. Maybe you can focus this a little bit. This is Sacsayhuaman, a giant fortress outside of Cuzco. Huge, again, stone blocks, people standing here. It is a giant series of walls on this hill that goes up to the top of the hill. Cuzco, the ancient capital of the Incas, is on the other side. These walls are definitely pre-Inca. A huge battle was fought here as well. Okay, you can see now the kind of the size of some of these blocks. This is one of the larger blocks at the wall. See here, notice how it's a jagged jigsaw formation. The blocks are perfectly fitted together. They're locked in. This block here weighs about 100 tons or more than 200,000 pounds. The only kind of cranes that can actually lift blocks like this are stationary cranes that are built for dams and things like that. There was a French stonemason who came to Peru, and he wanted to debunk all these stories of whatever extraterrestrials building this or levitation and whatnot. And he worked out like just exactly how primitive people could have built this. And one of the ways that he came up with that is that he said, well, you get so many, and it's really true. There's a formula there. If you get really so mmany, 1,000 people or whatever pulling on a giant block of stone, I mean, there's some ratio, you can move it. The one thing he couldn't figure out, there were several things he couldn't figure out, but one of them was that, he would say, all right, well, 5,000 people pulling on this stone would move it. But then he couldn't figure out where all those people stood. This crowd of thousands of people pulling on a stone. Okay, once again, you can see the giant blocks of stone. It's really huge. I mean, here it's not just the isolated block of stone the size of a railway car. It's like this whole thing is just built out of that, and it's a tiered sort of step pyramid type construction going back onto this natural hill. It's quite possible that this site was a Vimana platform for some of these ancient craft. Some of the kids at Ollantaytambo, the Indians who live in the high Andes in this area anyway are called Quechua Indians. And in fact, Quechua apparently is a dialect of Chinese and Tibetan. And many of the words, certain linguists point out, are identical in Quechua and Tibetan. In fact, the people look very Tibetan, even dress the same way, wear their hair. They make these colorful aprons. This is the sort of small little towns in the Andes you would stay at. If you're looking for the bar restaurant Texas, you'll You'll be in Peru, not in Texas. Here we go. We would follow, sometimes we would use llamas, alpacas like that. We would move through the high Andes and follow these ancient Inca roads into the jungles. The legend of the lost treasure goes that 14 mummies, gold-clad mummies of the ancient Inca empires, plus the golden sun disk from the Sun Temple, all kinds of gold artifacts were all moved to the secret city. Here again you can see the kind of walls. I mean, this is pretty much what we thought that Paititi would look like Machu Picchu. Now also around Sacsayhuaman you get these strange, like weird rocks just all carved. You see upside down staircases. Rocks are just kind of carved willy-nilly, helter-skelter. And in some places, this is extremely interesting, where you see what appear to be, these are two blocks of stone facing each other. They're about a meter or so apart. And then it has what appears to be these cogs for like giant machinery or something. It would fit in here, it would seem. And like this was like the teeth, and some like a giant cogwheel or piece of machinery or something would then catch in here and then move. You see weird places like this. It's really, as you just hike around in the mountains around Cuzco, you see all kinds of stuff like this. It's weird. Here, look here. Here's like a strange stone face and stuff like that. It's all carved here. Seems to be upside down. It's like this blonde just crashed. Who knows what's going on here? One explanation the traditional archaeologists try and give is that all these weird carved and strange things were like just practice for stone carvers, and they would just go out and weirdly carve these things all over. This is the ancient Temple of the Sun. Typical of the Spanish, whenever they find ancient temple sites, any kind of religious structure, they would partly destroy it and then rebuild it as a Catholic church. This is, so, I mean, again, you can see the finer construction down at the bottom, although even this isn't so great, would have been the earlier construction. Here's Spanish construction here. Actually, if you just move that a little bit to the left so we can see the far right edge of this slide. Okay. Yeah, go to the next slide then, actually. Should be down another picture of this, the Temple of the Sun. This is where the ancient treasure was kept. Okay, you can see here, particularly this wall, is all part, it was a round structure with the walls fitted together. Here's the Spanish church here. This was the ancient Temple of the Sun that the Incas had. It too was probably an earlier structure, even to them. The walls inside were wallpapered with gold. The 14 gold mummies of the Inca kings were all kept there. This giant disk of the sun, another disk of the moon, all kinds of, the Incas would create these life-size plants and animals and things out of gold. A tremendous amount of gold. And most of it, the conquistadors got much of it, but much of it went to these secret cities and also into these tunnel systems underneath Sacsayhuaman. The Incas themselves were great road builders, and roads existed all through the Andes. One of the reasons, it's said that the Incas did not have the knowledge of writing, and it's also said they did not have knowledge of the wheel, simply because they were primitive people. Well, the Incas had knowledge of the wheel, and they did have writing. The reason they didn't, the wheel particularly, and like wheeled carts and things like that, chariots or whatever, really are not much use in the Andes. I mean, they do have cars and roads today, but you really, because of the mountain roads and the cliffs and the bridges like this, having a wheeled cart just really wouldn't work. Also, llamas and alpacas can be beasts of burden, but they will not carry anything very heavy, and they will not pull a cart. Here you can see how they would have these bridges along cliffs. This is the kind of thing we did, follow these ancient roads out into remote jungle areas to see where they went. And they would definitely go to these lost cities, and we hoped ultimately to the lost city of Paititi. Okay, this is an interesting picture too, also near Sacsayhuaman. There are these tunnel entrances also at Sacsayhuaman. Tunnels just start going down from the gigantic ruins there, and they would go down into the earth. This is the entrance of one of them. There's many people would go in there back, particularly in the 1800s, because the story of this treasure was very famous. And they knew about these tunnels, and it was said that much of the treasure was stored in this weird underground tunnel system underneath Cusco. At one point, one guy went into this tunnel and was not seen for like a week. And then on Sunday, they were having a church service at the Temple of the Sun, that Catholic church now, where the ancient Inca temple had been. And in the middle of this church service, there was suddenly this pounding on one of the flagstones of the floor. And everyone was, frightened and was like, oh, it's the devil. And then the priest then, a Spanish guy, pried up this big stone in the floor of the church, and this guy came out of this floor. And he had his gold bar in his hand, and he was like, whoa, thanks for letting me out of there. I was going crazy, in this weird tunnel system. There are many of strange stories of this tunnel system there in the Andes, and they eventually, the Peruvian government blocked up many of these tunnels to keep people from wandering in there. So, if you go there now to Sacsayhuaman, you can enter some of these tunnels, and they just go for a short distance, and then they're blocked out. Okay, we would move into the remote areas of the Andes to get towards the eastern jungles. We'd often go by truck like that. And that area of Peru is interesting because you have high mountains and glaciers and peaks, but then suddenly you have jungle as well. So we would have to move as like our own private army, and we'd have to carry guns, and we would hire horses. Sometimes we would go for a month out into the back jungles. I went one time with an anthropologist from Boston named Greg Dare-Mengen, close friend of mine. But this is what it's like going out there. You follow these ancient roads. They sometimes are in bleak, windswept mountains, but then suddenly you'll drop down into these steep, jungle-covered areas. One of the things that has kept a lot of the exploration from happening in this area is that this area of Peru, the eastern jungles of the Andes, are almost constantly covered with clouds that come in from the Amazon. So even just flying over them in airplanes to try and get aerial shots, even satellite photography is very difficult because of this constant cloud cover that's over these mountain jungles. So now we discovered this on one of our trips, which is some rock paintings of what appears to be this llama caravan of the treasure of the Incas heading out into the eastern jungles. The story went that from this one town called Coricancha, the caravan of the treasure and the 14 gold-clad Inca mummies came through this valley to these rock paintings where there were certain special signs, secret signs, that would tell those Inca royalty and elite who are escaping from the Spanish, this is the way to Paititi, the secret city. So we move out. This again is the kind of mountain train we would go through. We would, as I say, we would travel for weeks like this. We would follow some ancient trail like that coming along, and then we would go out into the far, over the mountains and into like a certain jungle area. Here we go. We would ride horses, moving through the high jungle. Eventually, we got to a point where we couldn't take the horses anymore. We would have to leave the horses and move into the jungle. We would come to high mountain lakes. Really, it's weird out there, and still today, much of South America is unexplored. Believe me, there can be all kinds of things in the South American jungles. At one point, we had Kodak and Sony and different people sponsoring some of our expeditions out there. And a guy from Kodak once said to me, he said, "Wow, it all sounds great, these lost cities and the jungles there, but it's like, hasn't every inch of the world been explored and mapped already, And I said, hell no. There's out there in those jungles, we don't know. So actually, then we have to leave the horses at a camp, and because the horses cannot move through this dense jungle, what they call the Alto Selva. These are Quechua porters that we would hire, carry our food. It's very much, you know, your machete in hand, hacking your way through the jungle. I found the most dangerous thing out there was cutting yourself with a machete, which I do. So there we go. This is just before. Because it's pretty wild and dangerous in Peru, a number of revolutionary groups run around. There's a lot of thieves and bandits, plus uncontacted Indians. Near to where we were going is a tribe of Indians called the Copacaporis, and they have never been contacted by anybody and will kill strangers on sight. So we did have to carry guns, things like that. It moves like a private army through the jungle. This is kind of what it's like going there. Sometimes we'd have to sleep on these steep hills. It's a tremendous rainforest, and a lot of times you can be passing some ancient city and you won't even know it because of the thick jungle. Here we go, the kind of the Inca mummies and the skulls. You do find this a lot. As you start digging around in these cities, we would find skeletons, occasionally pottery, whatnot. This was then a tribe of Indians that we lived with for a while, Machigenga Indians. And they built these huts. They were actually living in this ancient Inca city. This city, and straight out of some Indiana Jones movie or something, had been looted by a German-Peruvian general named Essenbanger, whom had discovered the city, and then he used Peruvian military helicopters to fly into the city and loot it of all these gold artifacts and everything that were there. And then he, of course, vanished from Peru, and last we heard he was living in some villa in Spain. So, I mean, it is illegal in Peru to take any gold or any artifacts. I don't do that. In fact, metal detectors in Peru are illegal. And this is a Machigenga Indian. Now, it was interesting, too, with these Indians, as we lived with them, they were very, were friendly to us. The anthropologists I was with spoke their language to a point, Machigenga. Make an interesting point here about these Indians, just in terms of perception and how we see things and that, is that they live, their lifestyle there in this extremely remote area of the jungle is such, I mean, they have never seen cars or TVs or even, you know, just the sort of normal world of industrial Peru or whatever out there. If you show them a photograph, like a Polaroid photograph or a picture out of a magazine, they cannot see anything in it. Like if you show them a photograph of themselves, they can't see anything there. They see only colors. They cannot see a three-dimensional image out of a flat piece of paper. Now, you'll find this too if you travel around. I often have this problem in Africa. People cannot draw you a map somewhere. They just can't do that. They cannot translate the whole concept of, well, you know, you go down 2 blocks, turn right here, and then cross the street and go over here. For them just to take that kind of three-dimensional, well, this is the way, onto a piece of paper is difficult. You'll find with them, I mean, they could not see a photograph. If you show them a photograph, it's just a bunch of colors on a piece of paper. Even looking in a mirror can be difficult for them. So that's kind of a kind of interesting thing in perception. Okay, this is the kind of thing we would find out there. Giant, you know, blocks of stone, again, largely wiped out. This is interesting here. Some pretty large blocks of stone, pretty well cut, fitted together. Over here, more crude constructions there. But now Paititi itself, where the lost city of the Incas would have been something much bigger. I mean, like a Machu Picchu. This is the Festival of the Sun at Sacsayhuaman, where they recreate during the summer equinox the famous Inca festival. You can really see, I mean, thousands of people come from all over Peru sitting on these walls. And these walls are the ancient walls of the city, huge. One of the things that they like to eat, their favorite food there, is guinea pigs. So we would eat guinea pigs. This would be like, this is an Inca mummy, this kind of thing we'd find in different tombs, often buried with artifacts and gold, desiccated. The oldest mummies in the world, in fact, are found in Chile in the Atacama Desert, and they have been carbon dated. They're 11,000 years old. And they used a technique of mummification that's even more sophisticated than Egyptian mummification, which was they would peel the skin off a person, then take their insides out and whatnot, and then put it back in, and then peel the skin back on. Here we go. This is again Magic Angus. They wore these cloaks that they wove out of wild cotton, and this kid is wearing clothes that we brought whenever we would come to visit these Indians. And Greg, the anthropologist, was the main one to go in there. He would always bring pots and pans, machetes, clothes for the kids and stuff to wear, things they couldn't make themselves. So we lived with these Indians in the jungle to try and get to Paititi. We eventually climbed this one mountain, and we ran out of water, so we were drinking moss juice, squeezing moss into our mouths. This was an oven that we found. Now, one of the things that we felt we were on the right track of Paititi, this lost city of the Incas, because they had, growing around this area were coca leaves and the special coca tree. In Inca times, only the Inca royal elite were allowed to chew coca leaves. And so wherever, in theory, by finding coca trees in this area, it meant that this was an area that the Inca royal elite had gone to. This is the city, though, that was looted by Essenbanger, the Peruvian archaeologist, Peruvian general, I mean. But it seemed we never really got to the city of Paititi. Here also now you can see some of the walls here. This is a street in Cuzco. You see the giant megalithic walls here. Look on the other side, it's a different kind of wall, much cruder construction. Cuzco is an ancient city that has been inhabited for thousands of years, really a super place. I was later, the FBI investigated me because of a Peruvian guy who had been my friend. He eventually, what happened to him was, he came to America and decided that, well, he'd written a book about also this Paititi. He thought that Hollywood producers would be banging his door down, shoving contracts in his face, giving him millions of dollars, which of course never happened. And so he turned against all the people who had helped him, just out of frustration. I was one of them. And he basically filed a false FBI report to the FBI saying I was trying to steal this lost treasure of Paititi. I mean, only El Dorado itself, really. And the FBI, took it seriously. It is a crime to do that. And, and they were, like, questioning me. So, I mean, it was all pretty ridiculous that I was really stealing this. So I had been looking for the lost city. And, but as a result, the FBI keeps a close track on me now. Whenever I fly in and out of the United States, Customs gives me very careful going over. This is part of the surveillance that they use now. They scan, in the United States, they scan your passport. Your master record comes up on the computer screen, tells them everything about you. And in my case, it shows that, well, I'm supposedly stealing the lost treasure of the Incas. So, okay, now this is near to Lake Titicaca, also high in the Andes, is Silustani. And this is a weird series of towers, and also evidence of tremendous cataclysms. Here you can see these towers here. This is another good example of the huge, perfect ancient construction, perfectly fitted together. The giant block over here is just sort of lying on its side. And now you have what is extremely crude wall, just piled stones up. I mean, it's clear to anybody. Again, look at large lichen patch here or something. It's clear that really you have two different techniques of construction here, but the traditional archaeologists totally ignore this. To them, for whatever reason, these people just had a penchant for, building one part of a wall perfectly in an absolute incredible megalithic fashion, and then the rest of the wall they would just stack a bunch of stones up helter-skelter. So this is right near also Leonard Lake Titicaca. Okay, another shot here of the giant stones at Texahuaman. Here they're doing the ancient sun ceremony. The Incas worshiped the sun, as many cultures all around the world did. And one of the things they would do is they'd actually stare at the sun. Now, we're basically taught, and it's true to a point, that if you stare at the sun, you'll burn your retina out and you'll go blind. They developed a technique of of putting their hands up in front of them and looking at the sun through a kind of mesh of their hands, and they would stare at the sun occasionally just over short periods of time until their eyes got used to staring at the sun, and then supposedly the priests and things could just stare directly at the sun. And they believed that they would take this energy of the sun directly into their eyes and use this, and it would rejuvenate them. A famous explorer in America, his name is Gene Savoy, has written several books on that, and he claims he has his own church called the Egyp-Lian University of the Ordained, and the main technique of his church basically is this Inca sun technique of staring at the sun. This guy's like holding up a bowl, staring at the sun there. Okay, back in Silistani, you see these giant towers. They're filled in now. I mean, some of these towers were used, I think, similar as to towers in Ireland and other places. They would use these towers for tuning. There's an interesting book, it's in the esoteric bookshop, probably sells it, called Secrets of the Soil. And in that book, too, they talk about these towers and how these towers would take this energy, kind of a cosmic energy, and then put it into the ground and would help things grow. And they would tune the towers. These towers in Ireland, as the towers in Peru, would have just a door about halfway up the tower, and apparently they would tune the tower, according to that theory, by filling it up with dirt, so that inside the tower would be partially filled up with dirt, and it was a way of tuning the tower to a certain frequency or harmonic. Okay, you can see again how, these walls, how this looks real similar to the wall on Easter Island, kind of rounded, large lichen patches. You can see here how it's notched, slightly jigsaw pattern. This small cut right here was probably for a drain or something. This also right near Lake Titicaca. Again, more giant blocks of stone. This one right here might have been split in an earthquake, or like just kind of lying there, piled up. You can really see how that, more crude pile of stones back there. Okay, the next slide that I'm going to show you, actually, we're going to go to North America, where I had never thought there were really that many mysteries and lost cities in North America, particularly in the United States. It's basically what we're taught. However, what I discovered was, as I began writing my new book, was that there was, in 1909, the Smithsonian Institute excavated an Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. Okay, so in the now, ball court areas are found in Mexico and areas like that. Down in Mexico, Guatemala, they play ball courts. The other area where ball courts and huge ruins are found is in Arizona. Now they call this area the Hohokam Indians. Casa Grande ruins, we'll see some slides that just come up. Grand Canyon is up in here. Flagstaff, Sedona, Arizona, which is, I've got a house there. I grew up in this area, actually. It's right nearby. You have there's plenty of strange things in Arizona, as we're about to see. So, Hohokam Indians. Here we go. Now, the ancient, let me just make sure. There's one slide in here we just actually really have to see. Oh, well, pretty good if you see that one. Okay. So, now, Tutankhamun. This is from Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, one thing to say is that no Egyptian mummy has ever been found in a pyramid in Egypt. Despite what you may have read in Egyptology texts and things like that, never have they found a mummy in an Egyptian pyramid. The Egyptians did mummify their dead, but they were not buried in pyramids. They were buried in vaults deep underground, like Tutankhamun. Go ahead, just go to the next slide. I have trouble with that. Oh, sadly, these slides have been turned around. Okay, now here's what happened. In 1909, a front page story in the Phoenix Gazette was published, which said, you've got to put the slides in upside down for them to be right side up. Somehow these slides got flipped around. Okay, here we go. All right, bring that down just a little bit so we can see the top of the slide. Okay, on Monday, April 5th, 1909, the cover story of this paper was all about the Smithsonian Institute excavating an Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. The story goes something like this. An explorer, his name was Kincaid, was going down through the Grand Canyon in the late 1800s and doing explorations in that area. He looked up on the canyon wall. What he saw was like a slag pile coming down, what he thought was a mine. You could see a hole going back into the Grand Canyon. He then climbed up there, and what he discovered were rock-cut vaults and tunnels going deep back into the cliffs. Now this is exactly what you find at the Valley of Kings in southern Egypt. This is where Tutankhamun was found. This is how the Egyptians did bury their dead. They cut these rock-cut vaults going deep underground, and then they had false doors and weird passageways, and then down somewhere at the very bottom would be a vault with artifacts in it, and then a mummified body. Egyptian Book of the Dead would be painted on all the walls and things. This is exactly what was discovered in the Grand Canyon and excavated in 1909. They found, according to the article, hundreds of mummies, hundreds of artifacts, hieroglyphs, gold plates and things like that. Okay.
You read this one?
Yeah, it's okay. Go on to the next one. Let's see what we've got. Okay, sorry about that. Well, it's a fascinating story. It gets even weirder as I tell it. The lost Egyptian city of the Grand Canyon. So, but we'll do that one right after lunch, and then we'll go into the pyramids on Mars and everything. Okay, this is a slide from Tikal in Guatemala. This was a part of a frieze along one of the pyramid in the main plaza at Tikal. It was discovered in the 20s by a German archaeologist named Mahler. He took these friezes back to Berlin. They were in the Berlin Museum up through World War II. Then they were destroyed in the war. This no longer exists anymore. Notice how here it's a pretty interesting frieze. This guy's in a boat. There's a volcano going off over here. This giant building is collapsing on one side. I mean, this cataclysm is taking place, like Atlantis is sinking. There's a guy down here, he's drowning. This guy's escaping in a boat. You get a volcano going off. Apparently this is, a picture of, well, the destruction of Atlantis, something like that. Okay, in central Mexico, there are the ruins of the Olmecs. Giant, as they start digging in these swamps and things like that, they would find these giant statues. Huge blocks of stone carved out of granite and basalt. Many of them looked very Negroid. Thick lips, thick white nose, huge headdresses and things like that they would be wearing. This guy's carrying like a weird scepter or something. Here, notice this. He's got, these guys are sitting here, they have the crowns. Each of them are holding a child. The child's head is elongated. It doesn't have a normal skull, kind of a weird elongated thing. These people, the Olmecs they called them, or rubber people, we don't know who they really were, what they call proto-Mayan these days, but from a totally destroyed civilization, megalithic, that existed at least 6,000 years ago, if not more. Okay, here's a Mayan vise. Notice here how his head, notice how the nose comes way up to the forehead, and his head too is elongated there. They've made the head longer as it comes back. You'll see this too as we get into some more slides of actual skulls. This is a jade mask used by the Mayans. Like the Chinese, jade was the most valuable thing to the Mayans. The emperor of China used as his authority a jade disc, which he held up. And this was, like, instead of a crown or something, this meant he was the king having this jade disc. The Mayans used exactly that same thing. a jade disc as their authority. One of the mysteries of jade is that they don't know where all the jade in the world has come from. There are known jade mines in China. They believe that some of the jade in China came from Central Asia. They also believe that some of the jade in China came from Central America. Also in Central America, there are not many known jade mines either, even though they find jade all over. There's one jade mine in Guatemala, known as the Motagua jade source. And then there is a more obscure jade mine, which is in Death Valley near California. Okay, this is also a Mayan artifact. Notice how he looks very Chinese, kind of pug nose and stuff, the eyes. I mean, this could almost be something from China, big lips. This is like a terracotta thing. Okay, another Mayan thing. This is made out of pieces of jade. Notice the large nose coming down, the jade necklace he's wearing. Jade was absolutely more valuable than gold to either the Mayans or to the Chinese. Okay, notice here, this is taken in a museum. This guy has a beard. American Indians do not have facial hair. They cannot grow beards or mustaches. So therefore, it's said to be anomalistic when you see, as you do see a lot in Central America, depictions of people with thick mustaches, beards, that kind of thing. Here, this is also a statue from Guatemala. It's a pretty strange hat he's wearing. Looks like some kind of playing piece for a Dungeons and Dragons game or something. So yeah, some weirdo priest. I mean, when you see a lot of Mayan hieroglyphs and paintings and things like that, I mean, they're totally wild, more wild than a Batman comic or something like that. Some of these are in my book on Lost Cities of North and Central America. Okay, here we go. So pretty weird skulls. So as you start digging around in South America and Central America, you find these mummies and things. They are weird. I mean, look at this guy right here. Rather than an elongated skull, they flatten the skull out. His whole head is like weirdly flattened. His skull is enlarged. And this guy really looks like he's from some other planet. Notice the big hole at the head. They would do this. They would do these operations where they call that tree panning, where they would cut these holes, and sometimes they would put gold plates in people's heads, or just leave a hole there. Here we go too. Some of the mummies, they had red hair, very light brown hair. This head too is probably elongated. Skull deformities were very common, and typically were mainly for the upper class people. They had big mushroom cults in Central America, hallucinogenic mushrooms. The Taoists of China, too, were big on hallucinogenic mushrooms. And in fact, they believe that this was a major part of the trade between China and Central America was hallucinogenic mushrooms, jade, feathers, gold, turquoise, that kind of thing. Okay, another strange skull. This one too has been like flattened out, smashed. Other skulls are elongated. Okay, here we are. Now these are jade figurines, also in a museum. Maybe they can be a little sharper. Yeah. Notice here all the heads are elongated, flattened out. They would do this by putting pressure on the children's heads and then making them, while the baby's skull has yet to fuse, they would then deform it like this. In fact, I went to high school in Missoula, Montana, which is near Flathead Lake, largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. And the reason it's called Flathead Lake was because the Indians who lived around that lake did exactly the same thing. They had these weird elongated heads. Chinook Indians around in Seattle area also did this. You'll see depictions of this weird elongation. Notice how those guys too had very slanted eyes, Oriental. Okay, here is this statue again in Guatemala. So one of our expeditions down to Guatemala was just to find this statue see what had happened to it. We met with this lawyer in Guatemala who was in possession of this. He then took us out to the site. Sadly, this statue has been destroyed. And revolutionaries in Guatemala had used it for target practice. This area was part of a strong revolutionary faction for a while who controlled this area, and they just used this statue for gun practice, and they shot it up. It was made out of relatively soft stone, it turned out, and so today there's just kind of a stump there, and you can't really see the form of the face or anything like that. So that unfortunately happens to a lot of these things, but we did find in the same area what was other giant statues like this. Many of them just half buried. This is the Pacific side of Guatemala, along the Pacific coast. They use this area now a lot for growing sugarcane, and so as a result, they will clear these fields out of sugarcane, and when they do that, they find huge, gigantic statues and other things like that, just buried in the sugarcane fields. This thing's about 5-6 feet high. It's like half buried. Notice here again this diadem on his forehead going around. This is made out of extremely hard stone. This is basalt. His nose kind of had weird hieroglyphs. This statue was actually being worshipped by people who had come there. They worship them as gods. They'll go to these statues and do some of the ancient Mayan rituals of prayer, and they're kind of asking for whatever's missing in his life, financial success, or maybe he wants to have kids, not having kids or something. They'll burn incense. They light candles. Right over here is like a small bottle of rum. It's like giving offerings to this god. So we stumbled on this scene, and we're pretty amazed. They weren't too happy to see us since they were doing their ceremony. But this must have been part of some huge statue at one point. Now over here, also in this same area, was this giant stele. Now also in the Mayans used this, and the ancient Egyptians, and a stele would be a big slab of rock, which would then have hieroglyphs and things like that all carved in it. This slab of rock was like 20 tons. They'd somehow managed to prop it up. Notice this little square stone underneath. I mean, somehow where we were standing, which was out in the middle of this sugarcane field, had been some ancient city. It was probably all buried underneath us, and there was just the odd thing kind of sticking up out of the ground, like part of a head of some huge statue or this stele. One of the interesting things on this stele was right next to this guy's head, and these are extremely early hieroglyphs and pictographs. In this circle is this animal. And this animal appeared to be, from what we could tell, a bull or a cow, which is pretty anomalistic because supposedly there were not cows in the New World, in America or South America, or horses, they say. Although, really, there were cows and there were horses, it seems. Also, right around that, there was the age of Taurus. If you go to Egypt, they would use this, like for instance, as you walk into the temple at Karnak, you walk through this row of ram's heads, because it was, at that time, we were just entering the age of Aries. It's possible that this stele had something to do with the age of Taurus and the cow's head. Notice here again, this guy looks, could be sort of Egyptian or sort of Mayan. He's wearing a big headdress too. Also in this area, I mean, as they started just digging up these sugarcane fields, find giant, huge statues. This thing here, huge guy built out of this basalt boulder, probably weighs about 20,000 pounds. This one too, this giant head. These are all now in this park in this little town called Monte Alto, Pacific side of Guatemala. This guy is pretty weird. Looks kind of oriental, pug nose. He's got hieroglyphs on his cheeks. He's got a ram's horn coming out of the side of his head. Comes there and curls around. Pretty bizarre. I mean, this head's about 6-7 feet tall. Probably was part of some other bigger statue. They would find these things buried too, not just lying on the ground. They're typically under, like sometimes they would just maybe see a rock and they'd see the top of this head, In this case, it looks like maybe part of his head was exposed, probably everything down below was buried. Apparently, again, some tidal wave just wiped this whole area out. What's weird is you go through here and you find these statues, these weird heads. They're all megalithic, but where are the buildings? It seems like, I mean, they're destroyed or heavily buried. These things are floating around. This is again another weird head. Looks very oriental, slanted eyes. His head too, slightly elongated. Okay, here we go. Now this one was at this, one of the sugarcane factories had created its own museum. They were finding so many of these giant statues and heads around. Weird, got a giant headdress too. This thing was about 10 feet high. It was obviously part of some other larger statue, probably some 30, 40 foot high statue originally. Just like in Egypt. I mean, Ramses and these ancient Egyptian pharaohs would do the same thing, giant monuments to themselves. Seem to be finding the same thing in Guatemala. Here's a, this thing too, this was pretty weird. It was like a straight column with this ball on top, all carved out of solid rock. It seems like this was, to me, a stone representation of what was perhaps some electrical device. There are stories in South America and in New Guinea and other areas where the natives would talk about these lost cities in the jungles. There's one in Brazil that's very famous. Colonel Fawcett, the British explorer who vanished in 1925, would talk about this. These natives would say that, well, there's this lost city out there in the jungle, and in that lost city is a light that shines. And it shines day and night, and it's like this eternal shining light sitting like this on a pedestal or something inside the city. So it's possible, and there are ways to do that. In fact, you could cut crystals or something, and what they'll do is, particularly if you grow a certain type of a crystal, what it will do is absorb light during the day, and at night it will give off this light. As far as I know, this thing wasn't glowing, but it kind of reminded me of that kind, that sort of thing. Now this is the Caminal-Juyu, which was an ancient Mayan capital, also, which is all near in the highlands of the Mayans. The Quiche Mayan are one of the last of the Mayan tribes to still be existing. And what's interesting about this area and this city, it's largely destroyed, the Spanish destroyed it when they got there, is that going back underneath this city is another tunnel system. Many of the Mayan cities were connected underground by tunnels. We went into this tunnel system, and I was with a Swiss friend, with this Guatemalan guide, and where we were now, this tunnel that went back inside this hill for about 100 feet, and then at one point there was this pit. And this pit, again, like in South America, this pit dropped down for like 20, 30 feet, and we're standing right there, in fact, on the edge. I think it's right behind him. And going down, you would suddenly, I mean, you're already in one tunnel, then from the tunnel you drop down this shaft to another tunnel, and you're standing there, and you're quite far below ground at this point, in this open tunnel. And part of this tunnel is caved in. And we asked our guide, this guy here, we said, well, wow, what's going on with this tunnel? Where does it go? And he said, oh, well, this tunnel supposedly goes to this other city, which is 20 kilometers away, you know, off to the southwest. And they would, you know, and he said there was a time when you could just go from this city to that city underground through these tunnels. And there's an interesting story, too, of Geronimo, the Apache Indian who ran around Arizona. Arizona was the last of the American states, besides Alaska and Hawaii, to become a state. It didn't become a state until 1912. And the reason was because the Apaches were still fighting the American cavalry at that time. And one of the things that Geronimo would do was he was constantly eluding the American cavalry. And it seemed to almost have magical powers. And at one point, the American cavalry chased Geronimo into this box canyon in southern Arizona. And the American cavalry thought, okay, we've got Geronimo now and all his warriors, that's it, you know. And then as they went into this box canyon to get Geronimo, Geronimo wasn't there. He had vanished out of the canyon. And then the next day, Geronimo's troops were all seen in Mexico, quite a distance away. And they couldn't, I mean, the American army was just totally mystified. You know, how could Geronimo just vanish out of this canyon, suddenly show up in Mexico? Well, supposedly, the story is that Geronimo knew also of ancient tunnel systems like this that were created, and they would go through mountains and things like that, and he would use these tunnels, which today are still a secret, and he would escape and then go through these mountains to escape the cavalry and then suddenly show up in Mexico or something like that. They never really did capture Geronimo. Geronimo eventually gave himself up. Part of the deal with Geronimo was that if he gave himself up, his people could keep their land, and he too could stay on, you know, this Apache reservation, which is now near the Superstition Mountains near Phoenix. They did not keep their promise to Geronimo. They felt they had to get him out, so typical of the Americans, they broke their treaty. They did create a Apache Indian reservation, but Geronimo himself was moved to Oklahoma. Now, Lubanton is a city in Belize, formerly British Honduras, along the coast near the Yucatan, and this is the site where the ancient crystal skull was found. That famous crystal skull that has a movable jawbone. It's a life-size crystal skull. It's it's an amazing artifact. It was allegedly found in the city by this British explorer. His name was Mitchell Hedges. Now, Lubanton is very unusual because it is the only city known in the Mayan world that is built out of cut stone blocks. Now, if you look here, lichen patches here again, pretty large lichen patches. Relatively small, but perfectly cut stone blocks is the same kind of construction you see in Morocco, similar to at Machu Picchu and Cuzco, slightly smaller scale. Perfectly cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar. And the reason that they're moved out here is that an earthquake has hit this and caused the rocks to jumble and move out. The Mayans did not build cities like this. The Mayans built cities out of plaster and cement, much like the Romans did. Cement, by the way, was a common ancient technique. The Romans had cement, the Mayans did. They built their cities out of cement. But this city is not built out of cement. It's built out, like in South America, these perfectly cut stone walls. This probably was a Phoenician city in Central America. And part of the history of Central America, actually, and this will go back to also the Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon, has to do with the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars were, here you can see, these are megalithic blocks here. This is all part of Lubanton. You can see how it's perfectly fitted and fitted together. This was a port city on the Mayans, but apparently a Phoenician city, or at least certainly one used by them. In the Punic Wars, and one of the Punic Wars is where Hannibal takes these elephant army over the Alps and they attack Rome. But Rome eventually defeated Carthage and the Phoenician kingdom, and at that time they destroyed Carthage in the last Punic War, the third one. And what happened was most of the Phoenicians escaped, and they all had to leave. At this point, their main trading shipping bases in the Mediterranean had been destroyed, and they had to depart. And mainly they went to Central America, where they had already been trading. This was one of their cities. This is, however, a Mayan city. Now, Mayan cities always had steles in them. They were built out of cement and plaster and rocks, slightly smaller scale, although very sophisticated cities. There is a Mayan city right near to Lubanton, which has Mayan steles and all that. Lubanton doesn't have any of that. They say that there's more than 100,000 undiscovered pyramids in Central America. More than 100,000 undiscovered pyramids. Like this, as you go through the whole area of what's called the Petén jungles of northern Guatemala, the whole area, even was when the Spanish conquered it, the whole area is virtually deserted. Yet it is just filled with thousands of lost cities and pyramids. Okay, below is a normal satellite photo of areas of the Guatemalan jungle. Today, I mean, it's still one of the big mysteries of archaeology. What happened to the Mayans? Where did they go? They just vanished. This top photo is an infrared satellite photo which shows how all of this northern Petén jungle area of Guatemala is crisscrossed with a very sophisticated canal network. Apparently the Mayans in ancient times engineered this entire huge area of pyramids and pyramid cities, highly intense agriculture. Whoa. Okay, now I see what happened here in my slide. This is a stele, also found in the central Mayan jungles. Notice how this guy has got a thick mustache. There are pineapples down by his feet here. Let's see, get my hand up in the right place. Pineapples right down here by his feet. He's wearing a jaguar skin, Mayan hieroglyphs on the side. And he is holding some weird gizmo that looks like, who knows what it is, almost looks like an electric flamethrower or laser cutting device. Flames, kind of like a dragon mouth, and flames are coming out one side. He's holding it in his hand. Could be, here's another photograph of it. There's the actual thing. He's holding it. This is in a remote jungle city in Guatemala, where I took this. The stele is just standing out there in the open. I mean, it does look like some weird mining device. Zechariah Sitchin, in one of his books, which I think is a real good one, called The Lost Realms, he goes into how a lot of these ancient guys, apparently so much of ancient civilization was mining, and ancient mining, metallurgy, search for gold, platinum, other metals, and that a lot of these weird gizmos were mining tools of one sort or another. That could be what this is. On the other hand, this could be a jade scepter. The part of the symbols of authority were these elaborately carved jade scepters. It's possible that's what it is. We don't know. Okay, Mayan culture, pyramids were just everywhere in the Mayan culture, and even their society was pyramidically structured. And here you have the priest up at the top of the high priest, then various other high lords and whatnot, and then at the very bottom was your average peasant. And this is actually a Mayan painting from Bonampak, in fact. Okay, we see at the top, typically in Mayan history, one of the things that the traditional archaeologists always said was that, well, there couldn't really be any connection between the ancient Egyptians and the pyramid cultures in the Middle East and those in Central America, because the time frame is totally wrong. Egyptian culture and the pyramid building there was like 2000 BC, 3000 BC, while they claimed that the Mayan civilization was much later, more like 500 BC, that kind of thing. So this was one way the traditional archaeologists poo-pooed any ideas of any connection between the Egyptians and Mayans. They've totally proven that that is false now. This top illustration was just found. This is this giant bird statue at Zama, which was found in a lost city in the central Guatemalan Petén jungles just a year ago. And it is this giant 30-foot statue of this bird god carved along this pyramid. And they have dated this thing to 3000 BC. So now they have proven that the Mayans and the Egyptians did exist at the same time and were contemporary cultures. This bottom illustration is particularly interesting, and it shows how when you go into these Petén jungles of Guatemala, these cities are everywhere, and the jungles basically swallowed them all up. And the cities were built in this geometric grid pattern. The whole country was built this way and pre-planned. You see the stars, each of these circles is a different village or city within the Mayans. And they had, like, say, a capital city here or district with a star in the center, and then outer lying towns would go. So, and this was this form, this geometric grid pattern that the whole culture was laid out in. Where it says northern capital, western capital, southern capital here, around those two would have been the smaller cities laid out in this grid pattern. All these illustrations, by the way, are in my book, Lost Cities of North Central America. Okay, pyramids in Tikal. This was this typical Mayan-type pyramid in the central jungles of Guatemala. Relatively small pyramids. They also had chambers going down inside them. I I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of these all over the place. This is the main pyramid at Palenque, and it was inside this pyramid that a Mexican archaeologist discovered by prying up the floor in the central building there. He then found this staircase going down inside the pyramid. And in fact, the whole staircase was completely filled with stone and rubble. And it took them years to slowly dig it out, move down the staircase, and when they got to the bottom, there was this dark hole. Yeah, there it is. They found the famous Palenque slab, Lord Pakal, they call him. This is the slab that you've all seen in Eric von Däniken books and everything. This guy appears to be in this rocket ship. You know, he's moving controls and there's flames coming out and he's, taking off to Mars or something like that. It's a huge, huge slab, totally megalithic in size. All the stones and everything around it are gigantic. It's a massive chamber in there. In fact, according to archaeologists, the slab and everything of the stones in here are so big they could never have gotten them down through the stairs or anything. So they say that, yeah, the pyramid was built around the tomb. The tomb had to be put there first, then they built a pyramid. And he's in there. My own opinion is, as far as all this goes, is that this guy is not in a rocket ship. The comparative archaeologists like myself and even the traditional Mayanists, they claim that what's happening here is the descent into the underworld. And if you look at it carefully, I don't have a slide that really shows you a good picture of what it's like. It's in my books and things. Is that there are three phases. I mean, there are birds, there are monsters and things like that in this. It's a very complicated pictograph. And in fact, the Chinese had used exactly the same glyphs, and the Taoists, and that is the three worlds, and then afterwards, like kings or anybody dead would make this descent into the underworld, and that kind of thing. When I say that I don't believe that's a rocket, I don't think really. I believe that the ancients, people did have airships and aircraft. You will see that in a little bit. One of the slides, I go into a whole thing on that. But however, rocket technology was really not the way they propelled their ships and craft. It was much more sophisticated. This is Monte Alban in the state of Oaxaca, south of Mexico City. It's a huge city on top of a mountain there. And it too is a giant megalithic city, different layers of construction. The oldest layer, of course, is the most megalithic, the most precise. It's built out of areas of it are gigantic blocks of stone straight out of Egypt or Stonehenge of South America. Notice again large lichen patches everywhere. This thing's many, many thousands of years old. But now here, look right over here on this wall on the far right. Again, that's more recent construction. Basically just small stones stacked up, cemented in. Quite different than the gigantic blocks perfectly fitted together. Once again, another side of that, you can see the gigantic squared blocks. These would weigh 30, 40 tons fitted together. Okay, back to the Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. So, Jordan is enthused. Mysteries of immense, rich cavern being brought to light. Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from the Orient. They did find Egyptian mummies, Egyptian artifacts, hieroglyphs, even apparently ancient Hindu, things like that, artifacts. The guy who did the excavations for the Smithsonian was named Jordan, Professor Jordan. What probably happened was, here's the way we figured this out, is that what he didn't realize was that the Smithsonian Institute did not want, it's very much a political thing in the United States, similar to what's going on in Australia, this a political thing of, well, here's our history. Australian Aboriginals walked across, this land bridge from New Guinea 40,000 years ago, and then Captain Cook discovered Australia. Similarly, we have the same kind of dogma, and it is unfortunately political, which is that all American Indians walked across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska, populated all the Americas, and then Columbus discovered America, and here we are. Also, there's very much there's a religious element. For instance, the Mormons in the United States, they claim similar things, that many American Indians are descended of Jews, that kind of thing. And there is an element of that. I mean, many American Indians are descendant of Jews. You know, one of these. Okay. So, did ancient civilizations live in Arizona? I mean, doing this kind of thing? Absolutely. The Hohokam Indians. This is basically one of the few buildings that's left. It's right near Phoenix. In fact, Phoenix, Arizona is well aptly named, and the idea of the phoenix being this bird that would die, burn up, and then from its ashes would rise again. Phoenix is exactly that kind of a city. Phoenix is right between two major rivers, the Gila and the Salt River, and all through that area in ancient times were artificial canals lined with cement. Huge buildings, giant skyscraper buildings, also built out of cement like this, that were 3, 4, 5, 8 stories high. They remind me of buildings that still exist today in southern Arabia and in Yemen, places like that. This is called Casa Grande, which means big house. They believe it was an observatory. It mostly destroyed, an astronomical observatory. It's one of the few things you can see. Okay, here we are. This is relics from the Hohokams. This is like an ink well, where they would grind these ink pens, just as the Chinese do today. You have an ink stick, you grind it into the ink well, mix a little water with it, and then you're off doing your calligraphy. Now, one of the things that they do, okay, here we go. This is the Valley of Kings near Luxor in Egypt. As I said before, no Egyptian mummy has ever been found buried in a pyramid in Egypt. One mummy was found in one pyramid in Egypt. It was a Ptolemaic Greek mummy from the Greek period of Egypt history. This was after Egypt had long since fallen. This was after Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt. They found one mummy in one pyramid. He had obviously been placed there thousands of years after the pyramid had been built. So where did the Egyptians actually bury their dead? They buried them in these vaults cut into rock, into canyons, exactly like the Grand Canyon, in Egypt. And just like this, they would cut these vaults, and they would go deep down into the earth. This is apparently the same kind of thing they found in the Grand Canyon in 1909. Tutankhamun was discovered in 1924. A very interesting story of him. This is, again, the kind of thing that probably was found in the Grand Canyon. Egyptian mummies, artifacts, gold, fabulous treasures, no doubt. It's interesting to know, too, okay, more statues of the Egyptians. Notice the headdress and that kind of thing. Egyptians traveled all over the world. Very sophisticated. They lit their temples with electricity. They had some very high technology. Egypt was controlled by priests, however, who kept a lot of the knowledge secret. Yeah, go on to the next slide. Okay. Here we go. This is a stele in Egypt. This is Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their kids down here. They're worshiping Aten, the sun. Little hands of the sun. Aten are coming out. In pictures like this, the hand of the sun will always be holding an ankh, the cross with a little loop right in front of somebody's mouth. This is a border stele that actually marked the boundaries of Akhenaten, this New Age city that Nefertiti and Akhenaten were building. They fought a war in ancient Egypt. Many of the wars in there were religious. One of the things about the Akhenists were very much against mummification. The Akhenists believed that if you were mummified, you couldn't reincarnate. You can't reincarnate until your old body, and they did believe in reincarnation, until your old body has totally been gone back to dust, whatever. You can't reincarnate. So mummification was totally wrong to them. They literally fought a war in Egypt over it and lost, and basically. That's why, this whole thing about reincarnation and mummification, apparently, has to do with cultures that believe in reincarnation, like the Hindus and Buddhists and things, would never mummify the dead or whatever. They would cremate it. Today, Egyptologists do not understand this at all. They're still looking for the mummies of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and whatnot, which there will never be. They would never allow themselves to be mummified. King Tutankhamun was mummified, who was their son, but only because, and that was one of the ways that the Amun priest got in control of Egypt again, and they even had him change his name from Tutankhamun, meaning light of Aten or servant of Aten, to Tutankhamun, servant of Amun, and the huge Amun temples that existed in Egypt at that time. This again was one of the stels there. There you can see coming up. So this was actually a boundary marker for the city of Akhenaten. Here they are worshiping the sun, and it's like carved into this rock with the hieroglyphs. The Mayans essentially used stels for the same purpose, marking city boundaries and as political markers, that kind of thing. Okay, this is the Grand Canyon, what it looks like. Here you can see different trails coming down. It's what we discovered as we began researching this whole story. Wow, I mean, this was incredible. Could there really be this Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon? We called the Smithsonian Institute to ask them what they said about it, and they said, well, we, oh no, we don't know anything about it. Of course, and there's no proof, of course, or evidence whatsoever of Egyptians in America, they told us. What we then found, we started doing our research in the Grand Canyon. Well, as we went into the Grand Canyon, we found out a lot of interesting things. I also discovered that the Smithsonian Institute was definitely covering up all kinds of archaeological artifacts. It was something straight out of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark is where the Ark of the Covenant is sent to this giant warehouse, right, and nobody ever sees it again. That is all too true. If you ever, in the United States or probably anywhere in the world, found any anomalistic archaeological artifact, if you sent it to the Smithsonian Institution, you'd probably never be heard of again. I've dug up all kinds of stories on it. It's pretty horrific. Hopefully, Nexus 19 will have one of my articles on Smithsonian Gate. So anyway, we called the Grand Canyon and started doing our research. I don't know, some of you might have been to the Grand Canyon. Most people, the Grand Canyon is today very restricted. Right now in the summertime, you cannot drive to the Grand Canyon. You've got to drive to this park center. You're bused into the Grand Canyon by buses, and even then, you only go to this one area on the south rim, which is right up in here, I think. And what happens is, in this area, you're on the south rim, and you can just kind of like look out over the Grand Canyon, and you're not allowed to go anywhere except drive along this one area. Well, as we started researching into it, we discovered in the maps that this one area of the Grand Canyon had all these Egyptian names. Tower of Set, Horus Temple, Tower of Ra, Osiris Temple. Over here, Cheops Pyramid, that kind of thing. Isis Temple, right up here. This whole area of the Grand Canyon had all these Egyptian names. Then we found out that this area of the Grand Canyon is totally off limits to everybody. And no one can go there, and even rangers are forbidden to go there. And then they told us that, yes, there are caverns and caves in that area, and people aren't allowed to go there. And once we saw the names, we thought, well, this has got to be the place where this Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon is. There is an Indian tribe that lives in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, too, called the Havasupai Indians, and they, too, have... there are ruins and things like that there. Okay, this is what it's like, Oto, the Grand Canyon. There are trails that go down to these cliffs. So, this vault in the Grand Canyon would be something like, who knows, this is not a photo of it, but it would be like say there would be a door or something right here, maybe some little trail, and then you would somehow get into this vault by going back inside from the cliff face. There's another picture of the Grand Canyon, and this is what it's like up there. In fact, it looks a lot like southern Egypt. With the Grand Canyon, it is pretty spectacular and deep. They're mile deep at some points. Okay, now in northern Mexico City is the ancient Toltec city of Tula. The Toltecs were apparently the Phoenicians. So, sometime after the Egyptians had done this, the Phoenicians, after the Punic Wars, the Phoenicians en masse moved into Central America, and they set up their various city-states within Mexico. Here we have, these figures are called Atlanteans, even by traditional archaeologists, And the reason is they were gigantic pillars, not out of one solid stone. They're actually about 4 different pieces, or 5. And they held up the roof of this giant temple at Tula. This would have been the same type of culture who expanded up into Arizona and into the Grand Canyon, all through Arizona, New Mexico. This is an interesting photo too. This is Our Lady of Elche, and it's a statue from Spain. It was found in Spain. It is said to be many, many thousands of years old. They have a hard time dating it, but they say it's from 4,000 BC at least. You often see this in books on Atlantis and things like that, because it's like, yeah, you know, she's like Atlantean or something. In drawings I've seen of the actual woman herself, the full statue, is that on her breast, and apparently she was a full-sized standing person, and also has the sun, like the Atlantis sun symbol with the hands reaching out. It's a sun-worshipping culture. And very interesting too is the way she wears her hair, and these wheels on either side of her head. That is exactly the same unusual style that Hopi Indians, women, wear their hair today. If you're an unmarried Hopi Indian woman, you wear your hair just like that. And the Hopis, of course, live right near the Grand Canyon, by the way. The Hopis also have their belief in the destruction of the 4 worlds, that kind of thing. And at one point, they claimed that they went underground into these tunnels and lived with the ant people underground. It's one of the Hopi legends. Okay, here we go again. This is Phoenix. You can see here, this on the right is a map of all the different ball courts. Down in Central America and in Arizona, they played this game kind of like basketball with these rubber balls. These are the ball courts all through Arizona. Arizona was a huge, thriving cult civilization where they made canals. They turned the desert into this garden city. These are maps of some of the ancient canals around Phoenix here. These are the canal systems. Even some of these canals are still in use around Phoenix today. And this is the amazing part too of how, say, the archaeologists, anthropologists in America still and change our view of the past, is that, I mean, here these people build giant skyscraper cities out of cement, huge canals lined with cement and whatnot. But if you go to a museum and you see like a diorama of these people, they're like kind of naked with a loincloth and a piece of leather wrapped around 1 foot or something, holding a little stone club. Very primitive. And that's not how these people were at all. I mean, they dressed in beautiful cotton embroidered clothes and things like that, just as fine clothing as anybody in the old world dressed. But this is the way they don't want you to think of the ancestors of American Indians as any kind of advanced culture. It's kind of like you can have that in Mexico, but not in the United States. Here we go. You see these different, what is left of this culture, much of it has been destroyed, is petroglyphs and that, like that. Here, guys standing here. Notice how this one right over here, he's wearing sort of like an Egyptian collar. They would wear these metal breastplates, that kind of thing. Throughout Utah and other areas like that, there's many, they call them newspaper rocks, so these petroglyphs everywhere, vortex, spirals, almost like a yin-yang wave symbol down here. Here's this guy who's probably wearing a horned helmet, that kind of thing. Some of these guys have swords and whatnot. They actually domesticated sheep. One of the earliest reports of people going into that area of the United States were that they had wool clothing and huge herds of sheep. They had horses too, probably. Here we are, another newspaper rock. Lots of strange figures, vortex spirals here and there, different animals, whatnot. The sun symbol up there on the left, far left. In fact, this kind of symbol today of the sun is used as a state symbol for New Mexico. Now also in Arizona you have these petrified forests. These giant forests that were apparently there. Geologists tell us they're millions of years old, but believe me, they have not at all solved the solution of these petrified forests. It's pretty interesting. In petrification and all geological things, you have every cell of a tree has been replaced with a mineral, so that you now have, instead of a wooden tree, you have one made out of stone. Some of these trees, in fact, I don't have any good picture of this, appear to have already been sawn or something like that before they were petrified. There are ruins within this petrified forest in northern New Mexico, and in one of these ruins there is a petroglyph of what appears to be a pterodactyl eating a man. The picture is in my book. So, go ahead. Okay, the Great Pyramid. This is actually the Pyramid of Kempton in Egypt. Go ahead. All right. The largest pyramid in the world is, in fact, in China. This is a photograph of it. It's the only known photograph of the largest pyramid in the world. The Chinese have actually gone so far as to deny it even exists. They don't, yeah. Bruce Cathie at one point, you cannot go and see this pyramid. They will not give you photographs of it. This is a picture taken just after World War I in China by an aviator, and this is the largest pyramid in the world. Bruce Cathie tried to get information on this pyramid. He wrote to the Chinese government. He said to them, you know, oh, I hear you have this pyramid. Could you give me exact coordinates? I want to plot it on my world grid and all that kind of thing. The Chinese wrote back to him and said, there aren't any pyramids in China. You know, we don't know about this pyramid you're talking about. And he could never get a straight answer from them about this pyramid. Curiously now, this pyramid was painted different colors on each side. It was like yellow on one side, green on one side, red on one side, and black on another side. And that goes with the Taoist belief of different colors for different directions. The Mayans did exactly the same thing with their pyramids. The Mayans would also paint pyramids different colors on different sides. Okay, this is the Great Pyramid in the background with the Sphinx. Now, interestingly, they have proven lately that the Sphinx has been underwater. Geologists probably read about this in the papers. The Sphinx apparently is water-worn. Now, something a lot of people don't know is that the Sphinx is carved out of solid rock. Now, if you look here, you see these blocks of stone, whatnot here. This is not the original construction of the Sphinx. This is Egyptian archaeologists recreating it. The Sphinx is carved out of solid rock, and it's very, very heavily eroded away. It's solid rock. Several geologists have taken to Egypt now and said that the Sphinx could only have been weathered like this if it was underwater and being washed by waves and things like that. There are, that I know of, at least 3 structures in Egypt that are what I call pre-Egyptian. The Sphinx is one. There's the Valley Temple of Kempton, which is near the Sphinx, a huge megalithic construction without any hieroglyphs in it. And then the third structure is in southern Egypt it's near the Temple of Abydos, and it's called the Osirion. And it too is a giant megalithic structure without any kind of Egyptian hieroglyphs or anything in it, and it's down inside this swamp. The other structures that may well be pre-Egyptian too are the pyramids themselves in the background. So pyramids are found all over the world, including on remote Pacific islands and in the United States. In fact, the largest pyramid in North America is in Illinois, near to St. Louis. And it is called Cahokia. And it was a huge earthen pyramid, very similar to the giant pyramids in China. It was a giant trading city. It had a plaza with a pyramid of the sun and a pyramid of the moon on it. Here we go. Try and go back a slide if you can. See if we can get, okay. Right. The people were all through America, through the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, are huge pyramid cities everywhere. And if you go there, particularly to Cahokia, there's a nice museum there, and you walk through it, the American archaeologists will take you and show you these things. But the one thing they will never do is ever call it a pyramid. They call them temple mounts. And they say, the temple mount here, the temple mount there. And then if you ask them, you say, well, what's the difference between this and a pyramid? And I asked one of the guys, and he said, well, gee, I guess you're right. They are kind of like pyramids, aren't they? And I was like, yeah, well, right. If you took a picture of this, you're going to the next slide, I guess. And if you notice the pyramids in the distance here. This is what it looks like today. Well, and here's why. I mean, if you took a picture of this and you showed it to anybody in Mexico City or Egypt and you said, what is this? They'd immediately say it was a pyramid. A pyramid, by the way, means fire in the center. It's a Greek word. And now, here's the thing. So why won't they say the word pyramid? The reason why they will never use the word pyramid is they don't want you to say, Mr. Tourist, you'll say, oh, you mean these pyramids here in Illinois and Missouri? You mean like pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mexico? No, nothing like that. The idea that there's any connection between these ancient cultures is not, that's what they don't want you to have. All these civilizations are isolated from each other. They don't even think, and this is what we're told in America, that the pyramid builders in the Midwest of America had any connection with those in Mexico. This is the way they talk. It's like in Australia, you're basically told, well, even though Indonesian islands are only 100 miles from northern Australia, no Indonesian could have ever come to Australia, right? I mean, that would have been impossible. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's a bizarre twisting of logic. I mean, we're talking to PhD professors at the universities. This is, their dogma they give out, and people believe it. I mean, they managed to just warp our whole thinking of the ancient past so that what they say makes sense, and guys like me or Thor Heyerdahl or whatever, we're the nuts. I'm a nut anyway, it doesn't matter. So here we go. This is one of the symbols of Cahokia, the pyramid there in the Midwest, is this Birdman. And in fact, they use this. This is actually the logo of the site itself. Here's this guy, he's got this weird hook nose, he's got these wings. He's the Birdman of Cahokia. And you find these Birdman motifs in Easter Island and in Hawaii, other areas like that. Pretty common. Here again, this sort of was a trading civilization. All through the Midwest, huge pyramids everywhere. They're still finding them. Giant earthworks. If you want to see what a map of an ancient civilization and continent, look at the river systems. There you go. Where are the big cities going to be? They're going to be at the junctions of rivers and things like that. Rivers were the highways of the ancient world. And that's where, of course, the pyramids are all through the Midwest. In the Midwest, when they did things, they would open up some of these pyramids and mounds back in the 1800s, and I've got all kinds of reports of this. It was constantly in the paper. What would they find inside these mounds? They would find huge 9-foot guys, oftentimes in full armor with swords and things like that, 9 feet tall, inside these mounds. There are dozens of reports of this when they first started opening up these pyramids in Minnesota and Indiana and Ohio and Michigan and stuff like that. What happened to all these giant skeletons? Probably went to the Smithsonian Institute. So now, also at this, they had a wood hinge there. This, like other pyramid centers, astronomically aligned, lined up for equinoxes and solstices and eclipses and things like that. Right, so, I mean, they pretty much proved it was a wood hinge. So in this area, there are not really a lot of stones to build with. So you don't have a lot, it wasn't like say in Egypt or a place in South America where things are made out of giant blocks of granite. They were made out of packed earth. The Stonehenge astronomical part was made out of wood. It's basically what they had to work with. Okay, the pyramids of Egypt again, the three main pyramids. Pyramids again are found all over the world. This is the pyramid of the magician, also pyramid of Dwarf and Uxmal. Not all pyramids have to be square or four-sided. That's not necessarily. Some pyramids are conical and rounded. So it's not true that a pyramid has to be four-sided. My pyramid is the Yucatan. This is a typical pyramid at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. Notice how it's your classic sort of step pyramid. Coming down the side here were these dragons, and right at the spring and autumn solstice, you would have this weird phenomenon. 1,000 people gather there every year to see this, where as the light hits the dragons are moving down the side, and they suddenly animated, and it's a bizarre thing to see how that they're like moving and wiggling down the side, these dragons carved there. This is the Great Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan outside Mexico City. This is not built by the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a much later civilization. They had only moved into the Valley of Mexico a few hundred years probably before the Spanish came. This These pyramids too have catacombs and tunnels going down inside them, and are massive, made out of stones. There's a pyramid of the sun and a pyramid of the moon. There's also a giant pyramid to Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was this bearded, robed guy who, according to South American and North American legends, went all over North and South America 2,000 years ago, essentially doing things that Christ allegedly did, healing the sick, preaching brotherly love and harmless living, that kind of thing. That's it. That it? Okay. Okay, that's it, I think. And thank you.